The courtroom was packed. It was supposed to be just another routine hearing, but as the clock ticked towards the start of the case, there was a palpable buzz of anticipation in the air. The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, was set to make an appearance, and even though it wasn't his first time in a courtroom, having faced off against legal issues in the past, there was something different about today. This wasn't just any case. This was something bigger. Something personal. Dwayne had been famous for decades, his reputation as a charming, larger-than-life personality cemented in Hollywood, and of course, his legendary career in the WWE. Yet, today, he found himself standing in front of a judge who had built his entire career on a no-nonsense, harsh demeanor. This was Judge Wallace, a man known not only for his strict rulings but for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue. The man had roasted countless people in his courtroom, but he had never come across someone like The Rock. The judge entered, his black robe trailing behind him like the shadow of some ancient authority figure. He settled into his chair with a sense of calm, his eyes scanning the room, assessing every person in his domain. As he looked at Dwayne, a slight smirk played at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't going to be a regular day in his courtroom. Dwayne stood confidently, flashing his signature smile to the cameras and nodding politely to the judge. It was just a hearing, there was no need to be nervous. After all, he was used to the limelight. But what Dwayne didn't expect was the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Judge Wallace wasn't interested in letting him off easy. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Wallace began, his voice cutting through the silence. "You might be used to charming crowds with your movie lines and wrestling moves, but this isn't the WWE. You're not in a ring anymore. This is real life, and here, there are no tag teams." The audience chuckled. Dwayne's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He had faced tough crowds before, both in the ring and on set. "I'm aware of that, Your Honor," Dwayne replied, trying to keep his cool. "I came here to deal with this matter with the same respect I give anyone else." But Judge Wallace wasn't finished. "Respect?" The judge's eyes narrowed, a sarcastic edge creeping into his voice. "I find that hard to believe, especially from a man who spends more time flexing in front of cameras than in a courtroom. Maybe you should try flexing those legal muscles instead." The crowd erupted into laughter, and Dwayne's face went from amused to slightly uncomfortable. This wasn't what he had expected, and it was clear that Judge Wallace had a plan to put him in his place. The Rock wasn't used to being the butt of the joke, but he wasn't going to back down. He had too much pride for that. But before he could respond, Judge Wallace continued, "What's the matter, Mr. Johnson? No witty comeback? I thought you were supposed to be quick with the one-liners. Did you forget them all after the last action film?" Another round of laughter echoed through the courtroom. Dwayne's jaw tightened, his muscles tensing. This wasn't the first time he'd been made fun of. He had heard all the jokes about his movies, his wrestling career, even his massive physique. But the judge was pushing all the wrong buttons. The Rock could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had two choices: he could either snap back with an insult of his own, or he could keep his cool and try to turn the situation around. He took a deep breath, his smile returning. "You know, Your Honor, I've been through tougher crowds than this," he said with a wink to the gallery. "But I'll let you know this, just like in the ring, you've got to be careful who you roast. You might just end up burned." The crowd murmured in response, not sure whether to laugh or wait for the next jab. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I'm not worried about getting burned, Mr. Johnson. I'm just warming up. But let's see if you're capable of more than just flexing your muscles, shall we?" Dwayne's eyes flashed with a mix of frustration and determination. Judge Wallace was relentless. He wasn't about to give him a break. This wasn't going to be easy, but Dwayne wasn't going to let his reputation get shattered by a courtroom roast. He had been in tough situations before, but this felt different. There was something about Judge Wallace that he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just the man's authority or his biting sarcasm, it was the subtle sense of disdain that seemed to linger in his every word. It was as if Wallace didn't just want to challenge Dwayne's career, he wanted to break him down, show him that all the fame and fortune meant nothing in this place. Dwayne glanced at his lawyer, Sarah, who was sitting beside him. She looked calm and composed, but Dwayne knew she was just as taken aback by the judge's approach as he was. Sarah had always been the voice of reason, the one who kept Dwayne grounded in situations like this. But even she seemed unsure how to respond to a judge like Wallace. "Sarah," Dwayne whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "what now?" Sarah met his eyes, giving him a small, reassuring nod. "Let him make the first move. You're better than this. Just remember who you are." Dwayne took another deep breath and turned his attention back to Judge Wallace, who was now watching him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. It was clear that this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a battle of wits, and both men were locked in a game and neither one was prepared to lose. As the judge continued with his sarcastic remarks, Dwayne found himself wondering how far this would go. What had he gotten himself into? Was this roast just a momentary jab, or was it the beginning of something bigger? The clock on the wall ticked louder with every second, each one feeling heavier than the last. "Stay tuned," the voice in his head whispered. This wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. And with that, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The game had begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The courtroom fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Dwayne Johnson sat still, trying to regain his composure after Judge Wallace's unexpected roast. But beneath the surface, a storm of emotions brewed. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore, it was about reclaiming something he hadn't realized he'd lost in the courtroom that morning, his sense of control. As he leaned back in his chair, Dwayne let his mind wander. The man who had just been publicly humiliated wasn't the same person who had stepped into the ring decades ago, wearing tights and shouting battle cries. He wasn't just the man who had headlined Hollywood blockbusters or became a global sensation. Dwayne Johnson had a past. A story. One that had been forged in hardship and perseverance. And today, as he sat under the scrutiny of Judge Wallace's harsh gaze, he was reminded of that story. It all began in Hayward, California. Dwayne had been born to Rocky Johnson, a professional wrestler, and Ada Johnson, a woman of strong will and even stronger heart. Dwayne was the product of two worlds, his father's world of wrestling, and his mother's world of grit and resilience. His parents had split when he was young, and like many children of divorced parents, Dwayne had seen firsthand the complexities of love and sacrifice. His mother raised him alone, doing everything she could to keep food on the table, while his father's absence lingered like a shadow. In those early years, Dwayne wasn't the superstar the world would one day come to know. He was a kid just trying to make sense of the world. A quiet, shy boy who, more often than not, found solace in the gym or on the field, where he could channel the frustration of his personal life into something tangible. Wrestling was in his blood, but it wasn't his first love. Football was his passion, the sport he had hoped would lead him to a college scholarship, the way it had for many of his peers. But life had other plans. After high school, Dwayne was recruited to play football at the University of Miami, where he quickly became a star. He was the guy everyone talked about, the player who made the big plays. But as fate would have it, a knee injury derailed his football career before it even had a chance to take off. This was the first of many setbacks in Dwayne's life, but it was also the first glimpse of the resilience that would define him. While many would have been crushed by the injury, Dwayne refused to let it defeat him. He knew that, despite the challenges, there was always a way forward. That was when the world of wrestling called. At first, it was just a way to stay in shape, a distraction from the pain of lost opportunities. But as soon as Dwayne stepped into the ring, something clicked. It was as if the wrestling world had been waiting for him. He joined the WWE, initially under the name Rocky Maivia, a nod to both his father and grandfather, who were legendary wrestlers themselves. But the fans were indifferent. They didn't buy into the rookie with the clean-cut, all-American look. They wanted something more. Something real. And then, like a switch flipping, Dwayne transformed. He became The Rock, a charismatic, cocky, and unapologetic figure who captured the hearts of millions. He took on the persona of someone who wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and the WWE fans ate it up. With his brash attitude, witty catchphrases, and undeniable charisma, The Rock became a cultural phenomenon, winning championship after championship and breaking records in ways the wrestling world had never seen before. But behind the scenes, Dwayne was still the same person, the guy who had faced hardships, who had struggled to find his place in the world. The guy who knew the feeling of rejection all too well. Wrestling may have catapulted him to fame, but it was his mindset, the lessons his mother had instilled in him, that kept him grounded. In the years that followed, Dwayne made the transition to Hollywood, bringing the same larger-than-life energy that made him a star in the ring to the silver screen. Action movie after action movie followed, and with each success, he became more than just a wrestler. He became a brand. The Rock was a household name. But fame came with its own pressures. The more successful he became, the higher the stakes, the greater the scrutiny, and the more complex the challenges. When he sat in that courtroom, facing Judge Wallace's unexpected roasting, Dwayne felt that pressure like never before. He had faced media backlash, fans' criticism, and even personal doubts, but this was different. This was personal. It wasn't about a movie review or a wrestling match, it was about his character. His reputation as someone who could handle anything, who always had the perfect comeback. And here he was, sitting in front of a judge who seemed to have no respect for his fame, who seemed determined to break him down, not as The Rock, but as Dwayne Johnson, the man. As the laughter from the courtroom faded, Dwayne snapped back into the present moment. He looked over at his lawyer, Sarah, who was still seated beside him. There was no way she could have predicted what had just unfolded. It was clear she wasn't prepared for the kind of attack Judge Wallace had just launched. But then again, who could have been? Dwayne's thoughts shifted, and he realized something. Judge Wallace had a point, in his own twisted way. The fame and glory, the accolades and red carpets, none of it would matter here. He wasn't The Rock in this courtroom, he was just a man trying to solve a legal issue. And the best way to handle this was to be that man. To show Wallace, and everyone else, that he wasn't just a character or a punchline. He was more than that. As Dwayne sat there, a new sense of clarity washed over him. He wasn't going to let the judge get to him. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. Instead, he was going to embrace it. He was going to show Wallace that while he might have started as a kid with nothing but a dream, he had become a man who could face anything, no matter how big or small. This was more than just a courtroom battle. This was about showing the world, and himself, that no matter the challenge, he was always going to rise. The morning after the courtroom drama, Dwayne sat in his hotel room, his thoughts swirling like a storm. The echoes of Judge Wallace's sharp remarks still rang in his ears. You might be used to charming crowds with your movie lines and wrestling moves, the words repeated in his mind, each one stinging a little more than the last. He wasn't accustomed to being undermined like that, especially not by someone so blunt, so unafraid to take him down a peg. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. The skyline shimmered in the early morning light, a reflection of the life he had built for himself. A life of success, fame, and a relentless work ethic. But as Dwayne gazed out over the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. Judge Wallace's attack had been personal, not just professional. The judge had taken aim at his entire persona, everything that Dwayne had worked so hard to cultivate. It was like the judge had seen through all the layers of The Rock and went straight for the heart of the man beneath. Suddenly, the door to his hotel room creaked open, and Sarah, his lawyer, walked in. Her expression was calm, but Dwayne could tell she was just as uneasy about the situation as he was. She had been the one trying to calm him down in the courtroom, reminding him to keep his composure, to not let Wallace rattle him. But it wasn't just about the case anymore. It had become something bigger, a test of his character. "Hey," Sarah said softly, walking up to him. "I know that wasn't easy in there. But we need to focus on the matter at hand. This roast from Wallace, it's just a tactic to get under your skin. Don't let him win." Dwayne turned to her, shaking his head. "It's not just that, Sarah. It's not just the case anymore. It's like he wants to break me down, like he's trying to prove something bigger than what's going on in that courtroom." She sighed and nodded. "I get it. Wallace is known for this. He uses humor, sarcasm, whatever he can to make people uncomfortable, to get them to slip up. But you can't let him play that game. You're here for a reason. You've been through worse. You've got this." Dwayne's eyes narrowed as he thought about her words. He had been through worse, hadn't he? The failures. The injuries. The endless criticisms. He wasn't some shiny, invincible character on a movie set or in the ring. He was a real person who had fought tooth and nail to get where he was, and if anyone was going to take that away from him, it wasn't going to be Judge Wallace or anyone else. But what if he's right? Dwayne said, his voice soft but heavy with the weight of doubt. What if I've become this caricature? What if all the movies, all the wrestling, all the fame, it's all just smoke and mirrors? What if I've forgotten who I really am? Sarah's eyes softened as she walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You're still Dwayne Johnson. You've always been Dwayne. The guy who faced challenges head-on, the guy who never quit. The world sees The Rock, but you're more than that. Don't let one judge's words make you question everything you've built. Dwayne exhaled slowly, trying to clear his mind. The weight of Sarah's words hung in the air like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of uncertainty. She was right. Judge Wallace's words might have cut deep, but they were just words. He was who he was because of everything he had been through, not because of what others thought of him. Just then, Dwayne's phone buzzed on the bedside table. He glanced at it and saw a text message from his manager. We need to talk. There's something you need to know. It wasn't the usual kind of message. It felt urgent, cryptic. His heart skipped a beat. Was this about the case? Or was it something else? I'll be right back, Dwayne said to Sarah, his voice determined. He walked over to the bed and grabbed his phone, texting his manager back. What's going on? Call me. As he waited for a response, his mind began to race. Was there something more happening behind the scenes? Was Wallace's roast a setup, part of a bigger plan to take him down? He had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let some offhand remark in a courtroom ruin everything. Before he could send another text, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his manager. Dwayne, the voice on the other end said, we've got a problem. His heart sank. What's going on? There's a story in the press, the manager continued, urgency creeping into his tone. A leak, Dwayne. Someone's been talking. And it's not just about the case. It's about your past. Dwayne's blood ran cold. What do you mean, my past? Someone's digging up old dirt, stuff you thought was buried. And now it's all over the headlines. It's bad, Dwayne. Really bad. The words hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. What could possibly be worse than the roast from Judge Wallace? What could possibly be worse than the public mockery he had endured? I need to see it, Dwayne said, his voice cold with determination. He didn't need to ask for specifics. He knew the game well enough to understand that the press could turn even the smallest misstep into a wildfire. And if someone was going after him, digging up things from his past, this was only the beginning. As he hung up the phone, Dwayne's mind began to spiral. There was something bigger happening here. This wasn't just a legal battle. This wasn't just a roast from a judge. This was a full-blown attack. An attack on everything he had worked for. The storm had only just begun, and Dwayne knew it. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in his chest tightened as he walked over to the window again, staring out at the city below. He had come too far to let this ruin him. Whoever was trying to take him down had no idea who they were dealing with. They hadn't seen what he could do when his back was against the wall. The conflict was rising, and Dwayne was ready to meet it head-on. The morning after receiving the call from his manager, Dwayne found himself staring at the headlines that were now plastered across every news outlet. The story had spread like wildfire, and each new article seemed to pile on more allegations. There it was, in big, bold letters, The Rock's dark past, what he doesn't want you to know. Dwayne's stomach twisted as he scrolled through the details. The article was full of accusations, most of which were based on things he had done or said years ago, things he had long since left behind. There were mentions of his early struggles in the wrestling industry, his personal mistakes, and even old rumors that had never been verified. But the most damning of all was the claim that he had once been involved in a shady business deal that went wrong, one that had caused damage to a group of people he'd once called friends. At first glance, the story looked like an assassination of his character. But Dwayne knew better than to react impulsively. He had spent years in the public eye, and he knew that things were rarely as they seemed. He had always been able to turn a challenge into an opportunity, but this felt different. The media wasn't just calling him out for something he'd done recently. They were digging into his past, trying to tear down everything he'd built from the ground up. I thought we had this covered, Dwayne muttered to himself as he shut his phone off and tossed it on the bed. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. How was he supposed to move forward when everything he'd worked for was suddenly in jeopardy? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah, "We need to talk. Meet me in 30 minutes. This is bigger than we thought." Dwayne didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket and left the hotel room, making his way to the cafe where he and Sarah often met to discuss business. The journey there felt long, as his mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the media storm that was quickly spiraling out of control. When he arrived, Sarah was already sitting at a corner table, her laptop open in front of her. She didn't look up as Dwayne sat down, but he could see the urgency in her eyes. "Dwayne, this isn't just some random smear campaign," Sarah said, her voice low and serious. "I've been doing some digging, and it looks like someone's trying to destroy your reputation on purpose. The leaks are coordinated. There's a pattern." Dwayne leaned forward, the weight of her words sinking in. He had suspected as much. This wasn't some random attack. Someone was pulling strings, orchestrating a very specific campaign to take him down. But who? "Do we have any leads?" Dwayne asked, his voice tense. Sarah nodded. "I've traced the origin of the first leak. It's connected to someone from your past, someone you haven't seen in years." Dwayne's mind raced. Who could it be? There were a lot of people from his past who might hold a grudge, but he had made it a point to leave those behind. The wrestler who had tried to sabotage his career, the former business partners who had turned their backs on him, but who would be powerful enough to pull off something like this? "It's Travis," Sarah said, cutting through his thoughts. Dwayne froze. Travis was someone from the early days of his career, someone he had once trusted, someone he had worked with in the wrestling world before things had turned sour. Travis had always been a bit shady, but Dwayne had never thought much of it. They had a falling out years ago, and Dwayne had moved on, leaving him behind. But Travis had clearly never forgotten their past. Travis, Dwayne repeated, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "I should have known." Sarah continued, her voice urgent. "It gets worse. Travis has been working with someone on the inside. He's got connections, people who can manipulate the media, plant stories, and control the narrative. He's been building up this campaign for months. And now, he's getting close to achieving his goal. Dwayne's fists clenched at his sides. What's his endgame? Why now? Why me? Sarah shook her head. That's what we need to figure out. But one thing's clear, this isn't just about a few old rumors. Travis wants to take you down, completely. He's trying to ruin everything you've built, Dwayne. Your career, your public image, your brand, all of it. Dwayne stood up abruptly, the frustration building to a boiling point. This ends now. He knew what he had to do. He had faced worse than this before, had been through tough battles, both in the ring and in his personal life. But this was something different. He wasn't going to sit back and let someone from his past destroy everything he'd worked for. He had to take action. Get me everything you have on Travis and the people he's working with, Dwayne said, his voice firm. We're going after him. I'm not going down without a fight. Sarah nodded. I'm already on it. But Dwayne, be careful. This is going to get ugly. Travis has his claws deep in this. You'll need to stay sharp. Dwayne wasn't worried. He'd dealt with adversity before, and he knew how to fight. But this time, it wasn't just about winning a match or a movie deal. This time, it was personal. Travis was digging into his past, trying to use the mistakes and regrets to bring him down. But Dwayne had learned one crucial thing throughout his life: your past doesn't define you. It's the choices you make now, in the present, that matter. I'm ready, Dwayne said, his voice steely. Let's do this. As Dwayne and Sarah left the cafe, a sense of purpose washed over him. The storm was only beginning, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let Travis, or anyone else, control his narrative. The battle was just starting, and he was ready to fight for his future. The climactic journey had begun. Dwayne had never been more determined in his life. He had weathered countless storms before, broken bones in the ring, public scandals, career-threatening injuries, but this felt different. This was not just an attack on his career or reputation, it was an assault on his very identity. Travis had found a way to twist the narrative, bringing up his past and turning it against him. But Dwayne was ready to face it head-on. For the next few days, he buried himself in work. Sarah was relentless, gathering every scrap of information she could find on Travis and the people connected to him. The pressure was mounting from all sides: the media, the fans, the constant scrutiny. It was as if every mistake Dwayne had ever made was being put under a microscope. The articles, the tweets, the television segments, they were all filled with accusations, trying to dismantle everything he had built. But as much as the attacks hurt, they were also pushing him to the edge. Dwayne could feel the anger building inside him. It was an unfamiliar sensation, one that didn't come from a place of weakness, but from something deep within, a desire to prove that no matter how much dirt was thrown at him, he wouldn't be buried. He was pacing his hotel room when Sarah finally came in, her face grim. I've got something, she said, holding out a file. It's not much, but it's a start. Dwayne took the file, scanning the contents. It wasn't the breakthrough he had hoped for, but it was enough to give him something to latch onto. There were references to more shady business deals, things that connected Travis to a larger network, someone powerful, someone who was pulling the strings. And the deeper Dwayne dug into the file, the more it became clear, this was not just a personal vendetta. Travis was playing a much bigger game, and Dwayne was caught in the middle of it. But then, something caught his eye: a phone number. It was buried in the footnotes of one of the reports, but it was familiar. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. He had seen that number before. It was the number of someone he trusted. His mind began to race. Could someone close to him really be involved in this? Could there be a traitor in his inner circle? Who is this? Dwayne muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. Sarah peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening. That's his old manager. The one from the early days. The one who disappeared after all the trouble with the business deal. Dwayne's jaw tightened. This was it, the missing piece. The link between Travis's past and the present. Dwayne had tried to bury those days, the mistakes, the people, the broken promises, but they were all resurfacing now. And they were threatening to take him down. I have to talk to him, Dwayne said, his voice low and filled with resolve. Sarah nodded. I'll make the call. But Dwayne, this is risky. If Travis is involved, this guy could be the key to everything. We don't know what side he's on. I don't care, Dwayne replied firmly. It's time to face this head-on. The next morning, Dwayne found himself standing outside a small, run-down office building on the outskirts of the city. The building was the last place he ever thought he'd be again. The smell of stale coffee and old paper filled the air as he entered the office. It looked just as he remembered it, cluttered, dimly lit, and filled with the ghosts of a past he had tried so hard to forget. The door creaked open, and there he was, Mark, his former manager. The man who had been there when Dwayne first started making a name for himself, the man who had been there when everything fell apart. Dwayne could see the years of regret and hard living etched into Mark's face, but there was something else there, something more calculating, more guarded. Mark didn't say anything at first, just studied Dwayne with a wary look. The silence between them was thick with tension, as if both of them were unsure how to begin. Mark, Dwayne said, his voice steady. I need answers. You know why I'm here. Mark took a long, slow drag from his cigarette before flicking the ash onto the floor. You always were direct, huh? I don't have time for games, Dwayne replied, his tone sharp. What do you know about Travis? And why is he digging up my past? Mark hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. You don't understand, Dwayne. It's not just about you. It's bigger than that. Travis, he's working with people who have a lot more power than you realize. They want to control the narrative. They want to make sure you're out of the picture. And that means tearing everything down, your career, your public image, everything. Dwayne's pulse quickened. Who's behind this? Who's pulling the strings? Mark took another drag, then exhaled slowly. It's not one person. It's a group of investors, people who've been waiting for the right moment to make their move. They want to take you down, Dwayne, and it's not just personal. They see you as a threat. A symbol of everything they can't control. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. The world he had built, the empire he had fought so hard to establish, was crumbling before his eyes. The press, the rumors, the attacks, it was all part of a bigger plan. He wasn't just a target because of his past, he was a target because he represented something those in power couldn't stand. Why didn't you tell me this before? Dwayne asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why did you let me get caught in the crossfire? Mark lowered his head. I was trying to protect you. But I see now that I was wrong. I should have warned you. But Travis, he has a way of pulling people in, making them believe he's on their side. I couldn't see it then. Now, it's too late. The weight of Mark's words hit Dwayne hard. The realization that someone he had trusted had played a part in his downfall was a blow to his already battered sense of self. But it was also the push he needed. He couldn't afford to be weak anymore. He couldn't afford to let anyone, least of all Travis, win. Tell me everything, Dwayne said, his voice low and cold. I'm done running from my past. If I'm going down fighting. As Mark continued to reveal more details about the conspiracy against him, Dwayne could feel the emotional tide shifting. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for the truth, for the man he had become, and for the people who still believed in him. It was time to take back control. The weight of Mark's confession still hung in the air as Dwayne processed the gravity of the situation. The past he had buried so deep was now clawing its way back to the surface, threatening to undo everything he had fought for. But amidst the storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of betrayal, Dwayne felt a flicker of resolve deep within him. This was his moment. He wasn't going to back down. "I need to know everything," Dwayne repeated, his voice firm, cutting through the tension in the room. "How do we stop Travis? How do we shut down this campaign before it destroys me?" Mark shifted in his seat, his eyes wary but resigned. "It's not going to be easy. Travis has been working with a network of people, investors, media figures, even some high-profile personalities. They have a stake in bringing you down. And they've been doing this for months, carefully building their case against you. It's a machine now, Dwayne. And it's going to take more than just exposing Travis to shut it down." Dwayne's fists clenched. He could feel the frustration bubbling up inside him again, but he didn't let it break his focus. "So what do we do? I can't just let them keep tearing my life apart." Mark met his gaze with a look that Dwayne hadn't seen in a long time, a look of respect, the kind of respect that came from understanding the depths of someone's character. "You need to take control of the narrative. Don't let them write your story for you." Dwayne stood up, a sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. "How do I do that?" Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You have to go public. Take this to the people, Dwayne. Expose them before they have the chance to expose you. Get ahead of it. Make your story the one everyone hears." Dwayne's mind raced as he weighed the options. Going public was risky, there was no guarantee that the public would believe him. They might see it as a desperate attempt to salvage his career. But then again, if he didn't act now, the media would continue to shape the narrative however they saw fit. And Travis? He was counting on Dwayne staying silent, hiding in shame. Dwayne wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "I'll do it," Dwayne said, his voice resolute. "I'm not going to let them control this anymore. It's my life, my story, and I'm going to tell it on my terms." Mark nodded, a sense of approval in his eyes. "You've always been a fighter, Dwayne. I knew you'd come to this conclusion. Just be careful. They'll come at you harder now, and you won't be able to trust anyone." Dwayne gave a quick nod and left the room without another word. The decision was made. He was going to take back control, no matter the cost. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Dwayne and Sarah worked tirelessly behind the scenes, crafting a strategy that would turn the tables on Travis and his team. They knew they had to be strategic. The media was ruthless, and any misstep could be the difference between redemption and disaster. The plan was simple: Dwayne would hold a press conference, addressing the allegations head-on. He would lay out the truth, his mistakes, his growth, and the people who were trying to tear him down. It wasn't going to be easy, but Dwayne knew that confronting the issue publicly was the only way to clear his name. Sarah set up meetings with some of the top journalists and media outlets who had been sympathetic to Dwayne in the past. They knew it was risky, but they also knew that it was the best shot they had. The public needed to hear the truth. Meanwhile, Dwayne reached out to several key people from his past, including old friends from his wrestling days and a few well-known figures in Hollywood. He needed support, not just for the press conference, but for the storm that was sure to follow. Travis and his network were going to come after him with everything they had, and Dwayne couldn't do it alone. The day of the press conference arrived faster than Dwayne expected. The nerves had settled, replaced by a sense of calm determination. As he stood backstage, listening to the buzz of reporters and cameras, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. The turning point. The moment that would decide his future. He took a deep breath and walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding, and the room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they captured every moment. Dwayne's heart raced, but he stood tall, his shoulders squared. This was his moment. He would not let fear control him. As he approached the podium, he paused, looking out at the sea of faces. The journalists, the media personalities, everyone who had been a part of the story that had spiraled out of his control. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the tension in the air. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Not like he used to be. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dwayne began, his voice steady and clear. "I stand before you today to address the lies and the attacks that have been waged against me. I've spent the last few days watching as my past has been dragged out and distorted, as people I once trusted have used it to destroy me." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The reporters were silent now, hanging on his every word. "But let me be clear," Dwayne continued. "I have made mistakes. I have failed. I have hurt people, and I have learned from those mistakes. But I am not the man they want you to believe I am. I am not a villain. I am a man who has fought every day to build a better future, for myself and for the people I care about." Dwayne's words rang out in the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could feel the truth coming to life. He wasn't just speaking to the journalists in front of him, he was speaking to the millions of people who were watching from home, the fans who had supported him through thick and thin. This was his chance to reclaim his narrative. "And now, I'm here to tell you something else," Dwayne said, his voice rising with conviction. "There are people who I trusted, who are trying to tear me down, to use my past to destroy everything I've worked for. But I won't let that happen. Not now, not ever." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding as the reporters scribbled down notes, eager for more. This was just the beginning, but Dwayne could already feel the shift happening. The truth was finally out. As he finished speaking, the room was silent. The reporters didn't know what to say. Some of them exchanged looks, others raised their hands, eager to ask questions. But Dwayne stood his ground, confident that he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his future. The press conference was just the beginning. As Dwayne walked off the stage, he knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time in days, he felt a sense of hope. The storm was far from over, but now, he was in control. He wasn't going down without a fight. The days following Dwayne's press conference felt like a blur. What had once been a quiet, controlled existence in the spotlight was now a whirlwind of media attention, social media frenzy, and an outpouring of support and backlash from every direction. He'd finally broken his silence, telling the world the truth, but now the real challenge was just beginning. At first, the response was mixed. Some fans stood by him, applauding his bravery for facing the accusations head-on. They sent messages of support, rallied behind his words, and declared they would stand with him through whatever came next. But for every supportive message, there were 10 others condemning him, accusing him of being a liar, of using his platform to play the victim. The media, always quick to jump on a new story, picked apart every aspect of his confession, analyzing his every word, scrutinizing his body language. Was he telling the truth? Was this just an attempt to salvage his career? The questions flooded in from all angles, and soon enough, the public's opinion was split down the middle. The storm of media coverage was relentless, and Dwayne found himself constantly answering the same questions over and over again. But the real storm was brewing behind the scenes. As Sarah worked tirelessly to track down more information about Travis and his connections, Dwayne began to feel the weight of what he had just unleashed. He had gone public, told the world his side, but now he was a target. The people who wanted to see him fail weren't going to take this sitting down. The phone calls started the morning after the press conference. Anonymous threats. Heavy breaths on the other end of the line. A few cryptic messages warning him to stay quiet, to go back to hiding. They knew about his family. They knew about his friends. And they were watching. Every move. "Are you okay?" Sarah's voice was tight when she called later that day. The worry in her tone was palpable. Dwayne was standing by the window, looking out over the city, his phone pressed to his ear. I don't know, Sarah. I honestly don't know what I've started. I'm tracking everything I can, she reassured him. But we're going to need to stay ahead of this. Travis isn't going to back off. Dwayne nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I know. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. The second I did this, I knew they'd come for me. And now that they know I'm not afraid, they're gonna hit harder. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted him. Hold on, Dwayne said, putting the phone down and heading toward the door. It was Mark, looking even more haggard than the last time they spoke. The man had aged 10 years in the past few days. Dwayne stepped aside to let him in. I got something, Mark said quickly, his voice low, almost a whisper. It's worse than we thought. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mark handed him a folder, one that seemed to weigh more than just paper. Inside, there were photographs, surveillance photos, taken from a distance. There were shots of Dwayne's family, his friends, even shots of his house. Every private moment seemed to have been captured. And in the margins, handwritten notes that looked like they were tracking his every movement. This is insane, Dwayne muttered, flipping through the pages. How long have they been doing this? Months, Mark replied, voice grim. Maybe longer. I didn't think it was this deep until I started digging. They've been watching your every step, anticipating your moves. It's a tight network. Dwayne slammed the folder shut, his heart racing. Who are they? Mark hesitated before answering. It's not just Travis anymore. There are higher-ups, people you haven't heard of, investors, businessmen, people who pull strings in the shadows. They're all part of this. Dwayne's mind began to spin. So it's bigger than Travis, that means I'm up against a whole network of people who are trying to destroy me. Not just my career, my life. Mark nodded. Exactly. And the more you dig, the more you expose, the harder they're going to hit. There was silence between them for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in. But then Dwayne's expression hardened, a fire lighting in his eyes. Then I'll fight harder. The next few weeks were a blur of planning, press statements, and a constant flood of incoming threats. Dwayne didn't back down. He kept moving forward, stepping up to every challenge, facing the media and public scrutiny head-on. But the psychological toll was beginning to show. There were moments where the anger would bubble up to the surface, and he would have to suppress it. But there were also moments where he'd find a glimmer of hope, the unexpected messages of support, the fans who refused to abandon him, the small victories. But Dwayne knew this wasn't just about winning the public's favor anymore. It was about survival. He had to stop Travis and his network before they destroyed everything. Every move felt like a game of chess, anticipating the next step, countering every attack. And then, just when Dwayne thought he could finally take a breath, another revelation surfaced. It was Sarah who brought him the news this time. I found something, she said, voice tight with urgency. Something that could finally connect the dots. Dwayne's pulse quickened. What is it? A meeting, she said. Travis had a secret meeting with someone powerful. Someone tied to the investors. It was scheduled for the day after your press conference. Dwayne's stomach dropped. So they knew I was going to do this. They were planning to shut me down before I even had a chance. That's what it looks like, Sarah said. But there's more. I've got a name. Someone at the top of this operation. Dwayne leaned forward, hanging on every word. Who is it? Sarah hesitated for a moment, then answered, it's Marcus Reynolds. The CEO of Blackstone Investments. Dwayne's blood ran cold at the mention of the name. Blackstone Investments. The same company that had quietly funded and backed many of the most powerful figures in Hollywood and business over the years. The same company that had connections in every major industry. That's the final piece, Dwayne said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's who I've been up against the whole time. The next few hours felt like they passed in a blur. Dwayne was no longer just fighting for his career, he was fighting against a powerful system that could crush him in an instant. The odds were stacked against him, but there was one thing that kept him going: he wasn't alone anymore. With Sarah's help, he had the resources, the knowledge, and now, a target to aim for. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Dwayne felt like he had a chance. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to win. The days following the discovery of Marcus Reynolds' involvement were a blur of frantic planning. Dwayne felt the weight of the situation pressing in on him, but for the first time in a long while, he was prepared to fight back. This wasn't just about his reputation or career anymore. It was about facing down the very people who had spent months plotting to take him down, and he wasn't going to let them win. "Dwayne," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency when they met to discuss their next move. "Reynolds is the key. But we need more than just his name to take him down. We need solid proof that he's connected to this mess, proof that can't be ignored." Dwayne stood at the window, staring out at the city. His mind was racing. "I've been fighting this battle blind, Sarah. I trusted the wrong people. And now, everything is falling apart." Sarah gave him a sympathetic look. "You didn't have the full picture until now. But now we do. We can take him down. But we need to be strategic about it. Reynolds has connections everywhere. He's not going to go down without a fight." Dwayne turned away from the window and met her gaze, determination written across his face. "Then we'll fight smarter. We'll gather the evidence, expose him, and make sure the world knows the truth. But we need to move fast. Every day we wait, they're getting closer." Sarah nodded, understanding the urgency. "I'll start pulling together everything I can. We've already got a few leads. But we need to get to Reynolds' network, the people who are closest to him. If we can get someone to talk, we might have a chance." Over the next few days, Dwayne and Sarah's efforts grew more intense. The pressure was mounting, and every step they took seemed to lead to another dead end. They knew that Reynolds' network was vast, and there were too many people who had a stake in keeping the truth hidden. But the further they dug, the more they realized that Reynolds wasn't just some faceless businessman, he had connections in high places. Powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They needed leverage. Something that could shake Reynolds to his core. And then, the breakthrough came. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sarah had managed to track down an anonymous source who had worked in one of Reynolds' companies. The person, who only went by the name G, had access to documents, emails, contracts, financial statements, that could link Reynolds to the shady dealings that had been going on behind the scenes. It wasn't enough to bring him down yet, but it was a start. The kind of start that Dwayne had been waiting for. "I've got the first batch of documents," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "But there's more. If we can get the full file, we'll have everything we need to expose him. We just need to be careful. If Reynolds catches wind of this, he'll stop at nothing to bury it." They spent the next few days working around the clock, piecing together the evidence they needed. The documents Sarah had secured were a treasure trove of information, emails that connected Reynolds to Travis and others in the network, financial records that showed bribes and illegal dealings. But they needed the final piece, the smoking gun that would leave no room for doubt. It was in the early hours of the morning when Sarah got the call. "I got it," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. "The final file. It's all here. The full extent of Reynolds' involvement, all the dirty dealings. Everything." Dwayne's heart raced. This was it. The moment he had been fighting for. "Send it to me. Now." Within minutes, Dwayne was staring at the file on his screen. The documents were even worse than he had imagined. Reynolds' connections ran deep, deeper than he had thought possible. He had been orchestrating a campaign to take down not just Dwayne, but anyone who stood in his way. His hands shook as he scrolled through the file, reading the evidence that could finally bring everything to light. "This is it," Dwayne whispered to himself. "This is how we win." But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Just as Dwayne was about to pick up the phone to call Sarah, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was a threat. A simple, chilling message that made his blood run cold. "We know what you're doing. You're not going to win this. You've already lost." Dwayne stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the message settle in his gut. They knew. They had to know about the evidence. Reynolds wasn't going to let this go quietly. "We have to move fast," Dwayne muttered to himself, his mind racing. "We can't give them the chance to bury this." The next morning, Dwayne made a call to his lawyer, an old friend who had been helping him navigate the legal side of the battle. They needed to get the evidence into the hands of the right people, people who could protect it and make sure it was used to bring Reynolds down. The lawyer promised to contact key contacts in law enforcement and media, making sure that the information would go public, no matter what Reynolds tried to do. But Dwayne knew that it wouldn't be that simple. He was no longer just fighting for his career. He was fighting for his life. As the days passed, Dwayne felt the tension building. Every phone call, every email, every meeting, he could sense that someone was always watching, always waiting for him to slip up. And he couldn't afford to. Not now. Not when he was so close to bringing this war to an end. But the stakes were higher than ever. Travis, Reynolds, and their network would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They had already shown they were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep their secrets safe. But Dwayne wasn't going to back down. He had come too far to turn back now. "We're close," Dwayne said to Sarah one night as they reviewed the evidence once more. "But we can't let our guard down. Reynolds is going to come after us with everything he's got." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "We knew it wasn't going to be easy. But we're almost there, Dwayne. Just a little longer." Dwayne nodded in return, his resolve firm. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for his freedom. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The days bled together as Dwayne pushed forward with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. Every step of the journey was a balancing act between staying one step ahead of the powerful network that sought to silence him and ensuring that his fight for justice didn't put his loved ones at risk. With Reynolds' empire closing in on him, Dwayne knew this was the moment that would define everything. The stakes had never been higher. "Dwayne, I'm telling you, we need to be extra careful," Sarah warned, her voice filled with concern as they reviewed their plan. "We're dealing with dangerous people here. If Reynolds has even an inkling that we're about to expose him, he'll come for us. No mercy." Dwayne's jaw tightened as he looked over the documents, his fingers tracing the damning evidence. His mind raced, weighing the risks of moving too fast, yet understanding that time was running out. "I know, Sarah. But we can't back down now. We've got the proof. We have to act before they make their next move," he said, resolve hardening his voice. "We've got one shot at this." Sarah looked back at him, a deep understanding in her eyes. She had known him for years, and despite the impossible odds they faced, she knew this was who Dwayne was, unyielding, determined, and unwilling to let fear dictate his actions. It was a crucial moment, one that would either see them break through or break down. Dwayne couldn't afford to lose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for the truth, for the people who trusted him, and for the future that had already been nearly stolen from him. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Marcus Reynolds was not sitting idly by. He knew the walls were closing in. The evidence Dwayne and Sarah had uncovered could ruin everything he'd built. If it went public, it would send shockwaves through the business world, shattering the power structure he'd carefully constructed for years. The first sign of trouble came when Reynolds received an anonymous tip-off. Someone had gotten wind of the information Dwayne had gathered, and they were moving fast to ensure that it never saw the light of day. Reynolds wasn't one to panic, but this was different. The stakes were too high, and he couldn't afford any slip-ups now. If Dwayne was serious about going public, he needed to neutralize the threat, and fast. He made a call to an old contact, a fixer who specialized in dealing with problems before they became too big to handle. "I need you to make this go away," Reynolds instructed coldly. "Do whatever it takes. Dwayne Johnson is a liability. He's too dangerous to leave alive." Dwayne and Sarah spent the following days on edge. They knew Reynolds wasn't going to take their move lightly. The threats had already started flooding in, a constant reminder that they weren't just fighting against one man, but a well-oiled machine of corruption and power. The moment they exposed Reynolds, they would be marked targets. Their plan was simple: leak the evidence to the press, get it into the hands of investigative journalists who could push the story into the public eye. But even as Sarah set up the necessary channels, Dwayne's gut told him something wasn't right. They were being watched, and Reynolds wasn't going to let them make a move without retaliation. "It's time," Dwayne said, standing up and walking toward the window. "We go live tomorrow. There's no turning back now." Sarah nodded solemnly, her fingers hovering over her laptop. "I'll make sure everything is set up. Once it's out there, there's no going back. But we'll need the media's full attention. We can't let Reynolds bury this. We need it to be impossible to ignore." Dwayne looked out over the city. The bright lights of Los Angeles twinkled beneath him, but beneath the surface, everything was about to shift. He knew the world was watching. And soon, everyone would know the truth. The moment they'd been preparing for arrived faster than expected. Just hours before the scheduled release of the information, a storm erupted. Dwayne was jolted awake by the sound of his phone ringing. He glanced at the clock. It was just after 2 a.m. "Dwayne, you need to listen to me," Sarah's voice was frantic. "Someone's here. They're trying to shut us down." Dwayne sat upright, adrenaline kicking in. "What do you mean? Who's here?" "They've breached the house, Dwayne. They're in the building. I'm not sure how, but they're trying to stop us before we can upload the files." His heart sank. He hadn't thought it would escalate this quickly. "I'll be right there," Dwayne said, grabbing his jacket and heading out the door. He wasn't going to let anyone intimidate him, not now. Not when they were so close to victory. When Dwayne arrived at Sarah's apartment, the scene was chaos. The lights were dimmed, and the place looked like it had been ransacked. Several of Sarah's belongings had been thrown around, her desk overturned, and her laptop was missing. "Sarah!" Dwayne called out, panic rising in his chest. "I'm in here," her voice rang from the back room. Dwayne rushed toward her voice, finding her crouched down by a stack of files. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, but she was determined. "They took the laptop," she said, her voice steady but laced with fear. "They knew we were going to release it." "Who? Reynolds?" Sarah nodded. "He's playing dirty, Dwayne. Whoever he has on the inside is taking no chances. They know if this hits the press, it's over for him. But we're not done yet. We still have the backup files. We need to act now." Just as Dwayne was about to respond, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside reached his ears. A black SUV. The same vehicle that had been tailing him for days. "They're here," Dwayne muttered, his instincts kicking into overdrive. "We need to move." With Sarah in tow, they rushed out the back of the building, dodging the shadows and slipping through an alley. They couldn't afford to waste time. If they didn't get those files out, everything they had fought for would be lost. As they rounded the corner, Dwayne's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know where you are. You'll never make it out alive." The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but Dwayne refused to let fear control him. He had come too far to back down. "You're not going to win this," he whispered to himself. They were getting closer. The endgame was near, and there was no turning back. The city's skyline loomed ahead as Dwayne and Sarah sprinted through the alley, adrenaline pumping through their veins. The cold night air bit at their skin, but it wasn't the chill that made Dwayne's heart race, it was the realization that the game was no longer just a battle for the truth. They were in a life-or-death struggle now, and every move counted. "Dwayne, they're close," Sarah whispered urgently, her breath visible in the cool air. "We need to get to the backup location. It's the only way we can release the files." Dwayne nodded, but his mind was in overdrive. The message he'd received earlier echoed in his thoughts, "You'll never make it out alive." His enemies were ruthless, and they weren't about to let him expose the truth without a fight. The files they had were the only thing standing between them and victory, and they couldn't afford to lose them. "Keep moving," Dwayne muttered, leading the way through the maze of back alleys. They had prepared for this, an escape route that would lead them to a safe house where they could upload the files and make them public. But they hadn't expected Reynolds' people to be so close behind. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the alley, growing louder. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. They had company. "Get down," he hissed. They ducked into the shadows of a narrow alley, holding their breath as the footsteps passed by. Dwayne's pulse hammered in his ears. He could feel the presence of danger lingering in the air. They were getting closer. "We're running out of time," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "They know what we're doing. They'll stop us at any cost." Dwayne's eyes scanned the dark alley ahead, then turned back to Sarah. "We can't let them. The world deserves to know the truth. We fight for that." Minutes felt like hours as they continued their stealthy trek through the city. Dwayne knew they couldn't risk getting caught now. The weight of the evidence, proof that could bring down Reynolds, was more than just valuable, it was the key to their survival. If Reynolds found out they still had it, there was no telling what lengths he'd go to get it back. Just as they neared the safe house, Dwayne heard a noise. The unmistakable hum of an engine. The black SUV. "Sarah, hurry," Dwayne urged, breaking into a sprint. They were nearly there. They reached the building, a small, nondescript structure tucked between two larger buildings. The safe house. Their final chance. Dwayne fumbled for his keys and unlocked the door. They slipped inside, their breath heavy from the run. Inside, the room was empty, save for a single computer and a desk stacked with papers. Sarah rushed to the computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she plugged in the external hard drive that held the backup files. Dwayne watched the door, waiting for any sign of trouble. Almost there, Sarah muttered under her breath, her focus intense. The sound of tires screeching to a halt outside made Dwayne's muscles tense. The SUV was here. It was only a matter of time before Reynolds' people would be on their heels, and if they didn't move fast, everything would be lost. Come on," Sarah's voice trailed off as she hit the final key, her face lighting up as the files began to upload to the secure server. It was working. But the sound of the door rattling on its hinges cut through the moment of triumph like a dagger. They weren't alone anymore. "Get ready," Dwayne muttered, moving toward the back exit. "We have to go now." But just as he reached for the door, a voice echoed from the front of the room. "Dwayne, Sarah. You've made a big mistake." Dwayne froze. It was Marcus Reynolds. Reynolds stepped into the room, flanked by two burly men. His calm demeanor betrayed none of the panic that Dwayne felt. It was as if he had been expecting this, like he had already won. "I should have known it would come to this," Reynolds continued, his voice smooth and unbothered. "You really think you can expose me, Dwayne? You think the world will care about your little crusade? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you'll never win." Dwayne's hand clenched into a fist. He could feel the anger boiling up inside him, but he kept his voice steady. This is bigger than you, Reynolds. It's about the people you've hurt, the lives you've ruined. And it's about time someone put a stop to it. Reynolds smirked, his gaze flicking over to Sarah. You've got the files, haven't you? The proof that could end everything for me. His smile widened. But you'll never get the chance to use them. You're out of your depth, Dwayne. You've been playing this game like it's a fair fight. But I've been planning for this day longer than you've been alive. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Dwayne could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just about the files anymore. It was about survival. Do you really think you can stop me? Dwayne said, taking a step forward. Because I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever. Reynolds' eyes darkened. He motioned to his men, who began to advance toward Dwayne and Sarah. But before they could make another move, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. The unmistakable sound of law enforcement closing in. Reynolds' smug expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. You think you've won? This isn't over. Dwayne's eyes flicked to Sarah, who nodded, silently urging him to make the move. They had done it. The files were out. The truth was now in the hands of those who could bring it to the world. As Reynolds' men hesitated, unsure of what to do next, Dwayne turned to Sarah. It's time to go. They rushed out the back door just as the sirens grew louder, knowing that they had done the impossible. They had exposed the truth. And Marcus Reynolds would never be the same. The police arrived moments later, sweeping through the building and securing the area. Dwayne and Sarah had made their escape, but the battle was far from over. They had won this round, but the war was still raging. And no one could predict what would come next. But Dwayne didn't care. He had taken a stand, and in that moment, that was enough. The world outside seemed unchanged, no signs of the chaos that had just unfolded. But Dwayne knew better. Everything was about to shift, and he wasn't sure whether that shift would be for better or worse. He and Sarah had made it to safety, but their victory had come with a price. Reynolds' empire had deep roots, and this battle was only the beginning. As they sat in their new, hidden location, a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of town, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The walls felt thinner, the silence too heavy. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made him jump. We did it, Sarah said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and relief as she sank into the chair across from him. She had been working non-stop to ensure the files were uploaded to multiple sources before they made their escape. The media would have no choice but to cover it now. Reynolds couldn't stop the truth from getting out. Dwayne leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His eyes were tired, his mind still processing the events of the last 24 hours. They had done the impossible, they had exposed Reynolds' crimes to the world. But even as he savored the victory, a gnawing feeling of uncertainty lingered in his chest. We've got the truth out there, but it's just the start, Sarah, Dwayne said, his voice low. Reynolds won't go down without a fight. You've seen how far he's willing to go. Sarah nodded, her gaze distant. I know. He'll try everything to bury this. His people are already looking for us. But we've got the advantage now. The public knows. The story's out. They won't be able to ignore it. Dwayne wasn't so sure. As much as he wanted to believe that the truth would be enough to bring Reynolds to justice, he knew the system was flawed. Powerful people always found ways to protect their own, no matter how damning the evidence. He had seen it before. And now, more than ever, he had a target on his back. We need to be ready, Dwayne said. Reynolds has the resources to fight back. He'll try to spin this, make us look like the bad guys. We can't let him. We have to stay ahead of the story. Sarah crossed her arms, staring at the screen of her laptop. The media coverage was already starting to trickle in, with reporters picking up on the explosive revelations. But there were still holes in the story, gaps that Reynolds' lawyers would exploit. They couldn't afford to let those gaps remain. "I'm working on it," Sarah said. "I've already sent everything to a few trusted reporters. They'll make sure it doesn't get buried. But we need to stay one step ahead. If Reynolds has his way, he'll use his power to twist everything. We need to control the narrative." Dwayne looked out the window, his mind racing. The weight of everything they had done was starting to settle in. This wasn't just a fight against one corrupt man, it was a fight against a system built to protect those like him. Dwayne knew that even if Reynolds went down, there would be others waiting to take his place. The battle for justice would never truly be over. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Reynolds sat in his luxurious office, his jaw clenched in anger. The news reports were flooding in, and they all said the same thing: Dwayne Johnson had exposed him. The carefully constructed empire he had spent years building was crumbling before his eyes. But Reynolds wasn't one to give up easily. He had built his wealth on ruthless ambition, and he knew how to fight dirty. Dwayne and Sarah may have thought they had won, but Reynolds had resources that could erase them from existence, resources that went far beyond the law. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked open. "I need you to handle something for me," Reynolds said, his voice cold and precise. "Dwayne Johnson and his little partner. They think they're untouchable. It's time we showed them just how vulnerable they really are." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, detached. "Understood. We'll take care of it." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been underestimated before. But this time, he would make sure Dwayne and Sarah paid the price for their recklessness. Back at their safe house, Dwayne and Sarah continued to monitor the media coverage. They knew it was only a matter of time before Reynolds would retaliate. But they weren't backing down. Not now. Not when they had come this far. As the hours passed, the weight of their situation began to settle over them. Dwayne could feel the growing tension in the air, the realization that they were now public enemies. The police had launched an investigation into Reynolds' actions, but Dwayne knew better than to rely on law enforcement. Their past failures to bring down powerful figures had been well documented. This wasn't a fight that could be won in the courtroom alone. "We need to keep the pressure on," Dwayne said, his voice steady as he met Sarah's gaze. "We've exposed him, but now we have to make sure the world sees who he really is. No more hiding. No more pretending he's some business tycoon with a few flaws." Sarah nodded, determination in her eyes. "We'll keep the media engaged. We'll expose every dirty deal, every corrupt partnership. He can't survive this kind of scrutiny." But deep down, Dwayne knew there was more at stake than just exposing Reynolds. This was bigger than one man. It was about the system that allowed men like Reynolds to thrive. It was about the people who had suffered in silence, their lives destroyed by the greed of the powerful. And Dwayne wasn't going to let them down. As night fell, Dwayne and Sarah sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Outside, the world continued to spin, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. And somewhere in the distance, Marcus Reynolds was already making his move. But Dwayne had learned something important over the past few days. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of Reynolds. And he wasn't afraid of what came next. Because the truth was on their side. And that was all they needed. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Dwayne had been through many challenges in his life, but this felt different. The fight for justice had taken on a whole new meaning. As the dawn broke over the city, casting a soft, golden hue over the horizon, Dwayne knew that today would be the day that defined everything. He and Sarah had done their part by exposing Reynolds, but the real battle was about to begin. They couldn't afford to rest, couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not now. The phone rang, slicing through the silence of the room. "Dwayne," Sarah's voice came through the line, shaky but determined. "We have a problem." His heart sank. "What is it?" "It's the media," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Reynolds is already spinning the narrative. His PR team is in full force, and they're framing us as criminals. They're calling us hackers, saying we tampered with evidence. They've even hired a few reporters to spread lies about us." Dwayne cursed under his breath. He had known this was coming, but the speed at which it was happening was still a shock. Reynolds had resources, and he wasn't above using them. The fight for the truth was now a battle of perception, and right now, they were losing. "We need to get ahead of this," Dwayne said, pacing the room. His mind was racing. They had the truth on their side, but that wouldn't matter if they couldn't convince the world of it. "What's the plan?" Sarah was already thinking a few steps ahead. "We need to find a way to prove that Reynolds is manipulating the media. I'm contacting the reporters who've been following the story and seeing if we can't get a few of them to flip. But it's going to be hard. We'll need undeniable proof to back up our claims." Dwayne's jaw clenched. Reynolds wasn't just playing dirty, he was going all in, using every weapon at his disposal. But they had one thing Reynolds didn't, the truth. It was their only weapon, and they had to use it wisely. "We'll need to be careful," Dwayne warned. "Reynolds will stop at nothing to discredit us. If we're not careful, he'll bury us." Back at Reynolds' headquarters, Marcus stood by his office window, watching the sunrise as the wheels of his empire turned. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was confident that he could outmaneuver Dwayne and Sarah. They had made a mistake by exposing the truth, they had made him a target. Now, he would make sure they paid for it. He picked up the phone, dialing a number from his contact list. The line clicked open. "You've seen the news, right?" Reynolds asked, his voice a low growl. "It's time to turn up the pressure. I need the media on my side, and I need it now." The voice on the other end was calm, collected. "Understood. We'll make sure the narrative shifts in your favor. Make sure they stay focused on Dwayne and Sarah," Reynolds continued. "We'll paint them as criminals. We'll make sure their credibility is destroyed. Once that happens, the truth won't matter anymore." A cold smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He was already planning his next move, already thinking 2 steps ahead. He had lost the battle for now, but the war was far from over. Dwayne and Sarah didn't have the luxury of time. They knew that Reynolds was out for revenge, and that meant their every move had to be calculated. The moment they stepped into the public eye, they would become targets, and they couldn't afford to make a misstep. Dwayne sat down at the small kitchen table, his eyes scanning the news on his laptop. The headlines were exactly what he had feared. Dwayne Johnson and Sarah Matthews, hackers who stole confidential information, was plastered across every major outlet. The lies were everywhere. The narrative was being twisted. "Sarah, we need to act fast," Dwayne said, frustration lacing his voice. "If we don't find a way to turn this around, Reynolds wins." Sarah was already on the phone with a reporter she had worked with in the past, someone she trusted. "I've got an idea," she said, turning to Dwayne. "We're going to take the fight to them. We need to find a way to expose the people who are behind this smear campaign. If we can show that Reynolds' team is manipulating the media, we can make them look like the real criminals." Dwayne nodded. "Let's do it. We don't have a choice." As the day wore on, Dwayne and Sarah set their plan into motion. They reached out to contacts within the media, asking for help in exposing Reynolds' tactics. But the response was lukewarm at best. Many of the reporters they contacted were too scared to take a stand, afraid of the backlash from Reynolds' PR machine. But there were a few who were willing to listen, those who believed in the power of the truth, no matter the cost. With each passing hour, the pressure mounted. They were being hunted, not just by Reynolds' men but by the media and the public. The smear campaign against them was working, and the walls were closing in. But Dwayne wasn't ready to give up, not now. He had come too far. The truth was his weapon, and he would fight for it, no matter the cost. Later that evening, Sarah came to him with a breakthrough. "I've got something," she said, her eyes alight with excitement. "I found a whistleblower. Someone from Reynolds' PR team who's willing to talk. They've got evidence that proves the manipulation of the media." Dwayne's pulse quickened. "That's it. That's what we need." They quickly set up a meeting with the whistleblower, agreeing to meet in a secluded cafe on the edge of town. As they made their way there, Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that this could be their turning point, the moment that would shift the balance of power. But there was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. Reynolds wouldn't just let this go. He would fight back, and he would fight dirty. They arrived at the cafe, a small, dimly lit place with few customers. The whistleblower was already there, sitting in the back corner. Dwayne and Sarah took a seat across from the man, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. "I've got what you need," the whistleblower said, his voice low and nervous. "But you have to understand, this is dangerous. Reynolds doesn't take kindly to people who betray him." "We know the risks," Dwayne said. "But we can't let him get away with it." The whistleblower slid a flash drive across the table. "This has everything. Emails, recordings, internal memos. It's all there. It's proof of the media manipulation, and it's enough to bring Reynolds down." Dwayne grabbed the flash drive and nodded. "This is it. This is what we needed." But as he pocketed the drive, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He looked over at Sarah, who was staring at something behind him. His heart skipped a beat. Before he could react, the sound of a gunshot rang through the air. The gunshot rang out like a scream in the dead of night, the sharp crack of it jolting through Dwayne's body, sending a cold rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down, time stretched as his instincts kicked into overdrive. The noise echoed in his mind, a reminder that danger was always lurking just around the corner. Dwayne's body reacted before his brain could fully process the threat. He dove across the table, knocking Sarah to the ground, covering her with his body. The flash drive, the proof they needed to bring Reynolds down, fell from his hand and slid across the floor, just out of reach. The cafe was chaos. The few patrons who had been quietly sipping their coffee moments ago now scrambled for cover, ducking behind tables, and shouting in fear. The air was thick with panic. But Dwayne's focus remained on the immediate danger in front of him. He heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, closing in. He could feel the tension in the air, the certainty that whoever had fired the shot wasn't done yet. Whoever was after them was determined to finish the job. "Stay down," Dwayne hissed to Sarah, his voice a low whisper as he scanned the room. "Do not move. Stay still." She nodded, wide-eyed, clutching the edge of the table for protection. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, but she didn't argue. There wasn't time for that. They had to survive first. Dwayne's heart hammered in his chest as he carefully crawled along the floor, using the table as cover. He needed to get to the flash drive. It was their only leverage against Reynolds. Without it, they were nothing. The proof of the media manipulation, the evidence of everything that had been done behind the scenes, it was all on that tiny device. The sound of another footstep echoed through the silence, but this time, it wasn't a lone step. There was more than one. Whoever was after them had backup. Dwayne's mind raced. He needed a plan. Fast. The cafe door was behind them, the one possible escape route. But with at least 2 armed men in the room, getting out unscathed would be a miracle. The window in the corner of the cafe, barely visible behind a stack of old crates, offered another possibility, but it was far. Too far. He glanced back at Sarah. Her eyes were locked on him, a silent question in them. He didn't have an answer yet. The footsteps were getting closer now, and Dwayne's mind finally made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. Not this time. With one last glance at Sarah, Dwayne sprinted for the flash drive, sliding across the floor in a controlled dive. His hand shot out just in time to grab it, fingers closing around the small device. But before he could pull it back to his side, a voice cut through the chaos, deep and menacing. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Dwayne froze, his body tense, his muscles primed for action. Slowly, he turned toward the voice. A tall man with a grim expression stood just beyond the table, his gun trained directly on Dwayne's chest. "I think you're too valuable to lose," the man said, his voice calm, as though this were just another day at the office. "We just need to make sure you understand that." Dwayne could feel Sarah's gaze burning into the back of his neck. He knew she was thinking the same thing, they were in a no-win situation. At least, that's how it looked. But Dwayne was never one to just give up. "Give it up, Dwayne," the man said, his finger twitching on the trigger. "You're not walking out of here. Reynolds has bigger plans than just shutting you up." The man's words hung in the air. Reynolds had plans? Dwayne's mind raced. What were they talking about? What could Reynolds possibly have planned for them? But that question had to wait. Right now, survival was the only thing that mattered. "I'll make a deal," Dwayne said, his voice steady. His mind worked faster than his mouth could keep up, but he wasn't about to go down without trying. "You let me walk out of here, and we'll make sure Reynolds gets exactly what's coming to him. You'll have everything you want, money, power, anything. Just don't take me out of the game." The man chuckled darkly, his gun never wavering. "You think Reynolds cares about money? No. He's in this for the power. You've already cost him enough. What happens next is on your head." Dwayne's pulse quickened. "You don't have to do this. You can still walk away from this, you know. Just let us go, and Reynolds won't even know you were involved." The man was silent for a moment, as if considering it. But then, just as quickly, the decision seemed to be made. He raised his gun. "I think it's too late for you, Dwayne." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat, but before he could react, a loud crash echoed through the cafe. A second shot rang out, but this one was different. It wasn't aimed at Dwayne, it was aimed at the gunman. The man's expression shifted from smug confidence to shock as he collapsed to the floor, his weapon skidding across the tile. Dwayne's body reacted without thought as he rolled to the side, pulling Sarah down with him. In the blink of an eye, another figure stepped out of the shadows, gun still smoking in his hand. A familiar figure. "Looks like you two are in trouble," the newcomer said with a smirk. "But I've got your back." Dwayne's eyes widened. "Wait, you. What are you?" Before he could finish the question, the man spoke again. "We don't have much time. Reynolds has people everywhere. We need to get out of here before this place turns into a war zone." Dwayne didn't have to think twice. "Let's go," he said, his voice sharp. "Now." The trio moved quickly through the back door of the cafe, stepping into the alley behind it. The air was cold, the faint smell of gasoline and exhaust hanging in the air. They had no time to lose. Dwayne's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act of violence. The person who had just saved them, he had a purpose. Dwayne could feel it. "Who are you?" Dwayne asked, looking over at the mysterious figure. The man grinned, though it was a grim, dangerous smile. "Someone who doesn't want to see Reynolds win. Let's just say I'm on your side, for now." Dwayne and Sarah had barely taken 3 steps when the sound of a distant siren pierced the night air. It was close, too close. The alley was narrow and unlit, with shadows creeping around them like silent sentinels. For a moment, Dwayne thought they were safe, but the tension in the air told him otherwise. The man who had saved them didn't break stride. His calm demeanor in the face of imminent danger sent a shiver down Dwayne's spine. He was no ordinary person. Whoever he was, he had resources, skills, and knowledge that made him an unexpected, but necessary, ally. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but edged with suspicion. "And why should we trust you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was following them before giving them a small, cryptic smile. "Let's just say my interests align with yours. For now." Dwayne didn't have the luxury to dig deeper. They were being hunted, and every second they stood still increased their chances of being caught. "We need to move," he urged. "Reynolds' people won't stop until they find us." The man nodded and started walking faster, leading them through the winding alleys. Dwayne was on edge, his senses on high alert. The sound of the siren was still getting louder, and he knew that they couldn't afford to be caught in a chase. "So, what exactly is going on here?" Sarah pressed, her voice low, but not without frustration. "Who are you working for? Why is Reynolds trying to kill us?" The man looked over his shoulder, his face grim. "You're asking the wrong questions. The question you should be asking is, why is Reynolds so desperate to silence you too?" Dwayne exchanged a glance with Sarah. That question, the one that had been haunting him ever since they had exposed Reynolds' corrupt dealings, was the key. Why did Reynolds want them out of the picture so badly? What was he hiding that went beyond a mere media manipulation? Before Dwayne could respond, the man spoke again. "Reynolds is playing a much bigger game than you think. This isn't just about destroying you, it's about something much more dangerous." They turned a corner, and the alley opened up to a small parking lot with a few cars scattered about. The man led them to an unmarked black SUV, its dark windows reflecting the dim light of the street lamp. He opened the back door and gestured for them to get in. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice now sharp with urgency. "Get in. I'll explain everything on the way." Dwayne hesitated for a moment but then followed Sarah into the vehicle. As the door slammed shut behind them, the man started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot. Dwayne's mind raced as the vehicle sped through the streets. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving closer to a truth they weren't prepared for. The SUV navigated through the night, the city blurring by in streaks of light. Dwayne's nerves were still on edge, his mind fixated on the flash drive in his pocket. He had to keep reminding himself that they still had the proof, everything Reynolds was trying to hide was right there, in their hands. But with every minute that passed, the stakes grew higher. The man driving the SUV finally broke the silence. "You're asking why Reynolds wants to silence you," he said, his voice low but clear. "Here's the thing. It's not just the media manipulation or the shady business deals. Reynolds is involved in something much darker." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean? What's darker than what we've already exposed?" The man's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. "Reynolds is involved in an international money laundering operation. He's using his position, his influence, to funnel billions of dollars into underground markets. And that's not even the worst part." Dwayne felt a chill settle in his chest. "Go on." "The worst part," the man continued, "is that he's funding criminal organizations all over the world, organizations that deal in arms, drugs, human trafficking. You name it. And he's doing it through a network of shell companies and media conglomerates. His empire isn't just built on business, it's built on blood money." A heavy silence fell over the car. Dwayne and Sarah exchanged glances, both processing the gravity of what the man had just revealed. This wasn't just about corporate greed. It was about power, corruption, and lives destroyed in the name of profit. "Why are you telling us this?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. What's in it for you? The man's face remained unreadable. I have my reasons. I've seen the damage Reynolds has done, and I'm not going to stand by and let him get away with it. If you two have the proof that can take him down, I'll help you expose him. Dwayne narrowed his eyes. And what's your angle? Why help us? The man's lips twitched into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Because you have something that can bring him to his knees. And because I've been watching him for years. I know what he's capable of, and I'm tired of waiting for someone else to step up. Dwayne's grip tightened on the seat. So, you're saying this is personal? The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes flicking to the road ahead. But after a moment, he nodded. Let's just say I have a vested interest in making sure Reynolds pays for everything he's done. But don't get any ideas. I'm not here to be your hero. I'm here to get the job done. Nothing more. Dwayne thought about it for a second, weighing his options. It didn't matter why this man was helping them, what mattered was that they had an ally in the fight against Reynolds, someone with knowledge of the inner workings of the enemy. The battle was no longer just about exposing the truth, it was about survival. We'll take whatever help we can get, Dwayne said finally, his voice resolute. But if you cross us, we'll turn on you just as fast as we turned on Reynolds. The man grinned. Understood. Now, we're almost at our destination. Buckle up. Things are about to get interesting. The SUV continued its journey, the cityscape now giving way to more industrial areas, darker and quieter. Dwayne felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were on the edge of something much bigger than they had initially realized. And now that they were in the middle of it, there was no turning back. As the vehicle slowed to a stop outside a warehouse, Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was where the real battle would begin. The SUV came to a halt with a soft screech of its tires against the cracked asphalt. Dwayne's eyes flickered toward the dark, looming silhouette of the warehouse before him. It looked abandoned, the metal siding corroded with age and neglect. The only sound was the faint hum of the city in the distance and the steady rustle of wind. This is it, the man driving the vehicle said, his voice low, but resolute. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes locked on Dwayne and Sarah. No turning back now. You're about to get the answers you've been asking for. Dwayne felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He had been running on instinct for too long, each step driven by survival, but now, the truth they sought was finally within their reach. The weight of the unknown loomed over him. Was this really the place? Would this warehouse hold the key to bringing down Reynolds, or would it be another dead end? The man killed the engine and turned to face them. Stay close, he warned. And don't do anything stupid. Without waiting for a response, he climbed out of the car, leaving Dwayne and Sarah to exchange silent glances. Sarah's face was tight with worry, her hands still trembling from the gunfight earlier, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of resolve. She wasn't backing down now. Dwayne took a deep breath, shoved open the door, and stepped into the cool night air. His heart hammered in his chest, but there was no turning back. He couldn't shake the feeling that this warehouse was more than just a hidden meeting place, it was a crossroads. A place where everything they had fought for, all the secrets they had uncovered, would either come to a head, or fall apart. The man led them through a rusted iron gate that creaked in protest before guiding them toward the entrance of the warehouse. As they walked, Dwayne scanned the perimeter, his senses alert to any movement. The darkness seemed to swallow them whole as the man stopped in front of the metal door, which was slightly ajar. You've got to be kidding me, Sarah muttered, eyeing the door warily. This is where we're supposed to get our answers. The man didn't respond, just pushed the door open wider and motioned for them to follow. Inside, the warehouse was massive. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, some labeled with shipping codes Dwayne didn't recognize. The dim light from a single hanging bulb in the center of the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows over the otherwise empty space. The man led them deeper into the cavernous interior, his steps echoing off the concrete floor. He stopped in front of an old desk that appeared to have been hastily abandoned. Papers were scattered across the surface, and the chair behind it was tipped over. "What's this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It looks like a storage unit." The man leaned over the desk, swiping away the papers with a motion that was almost too casual, as if he had done this many times before. "This is where Reynolds does his real work. It's where his empire begins." Dwayne frowned. "What do you mean by empire? You said it was about money laundering, but why a warehouse?" The man finally turned to face them, his expression grim. "Because this is where the shipments are handled, the illegal arms, the drugs, the weapons. This place is part of a much larger operation. Reynolds uses this warehouse to move goods that can't be tracked, to build his power." The pieces were falling into place, but Dwayne needed more information. "So, you brought us here because it's part of the operation?" His voice was sharp, demanding answers. "We need more than just a warehouse. We need proof, something concrete we can use against him." The man's eyes glinted with a knowing look, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, you'll get proof. But what I'm about to show you will shake you both to your core." He turned sharply and walked to a large steel door at the back of the warehouse. It was padlocked, the chains hanging loosely, as if no one had bothered to secure it properly in ages. The man broke the lock with a quick twist of his wrist, revealing a room beyond, its contents hidden in shadow. "Wait here," the man instructed, and before Dwayne or Sarah could protest, he disappeared into the room. Dwayne exchanged a look with Sarah. "Do you trust him?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "We don't have much of a choice. Whatever happens next, we need to keep moving forward." Dwayne was about to respond when the man returned, holding something large in his hands, something covered in a dark cloth. He set it on the table in front of them with a thud. "Take a look," the man said, his voice low. He didn't seem to be joking this time. Dwayne and Sarah both leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with curiosity. With a swift motion, the man pulled the cloth off the object, revealing an assortment of digital equipment, servers, wires, monitors, an entire command center packed into a single, inconspicuous room. "Is this his secret operation?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded. "This is where Reynolds monitors everything, the media, the businesses, the accounts. He's been using this setup to control entire industries, manipulate world events, and fund his criminal network. Every dirty deal, every shady partnership, it's all here, archived and ready to be sold." Dwayne felt a sickening knot twist in his stomach. "So, this is it. This is the proof we need." The man nodded again. "Exactly. All of it. But there's one more thing I need to show you." He pressed a button on a nearby console, and a screen flickered to life. On it appeared a detailed map, with multiple locations blinking in red. "These are the operations that Reynolds is currently running, his money laundering schemes, his criminal networks, even a few high-level targets he's got on his radar. You'll want to take a close look at this." Dwayne's eyes scanned the map, and his heart sank as he realized just how vast Reynolds' operation really was. It wasn't just about media control. Reynolds had his fingers in everything. Global networks. Political assassinations. A powerful web that stretched across borders and continents. He wasn't just a media mogul, he was a shadow ruler, pulling strings from the darkness. As Dwayne turned back to the man, his voice was low but resolute. "This ends tonight. He can't keep getting away with this." The man looked at him, his face unreadable. "That's the plan. But be careful. Reynolds has eyes everywhere. He won't go down without a fight." Dwayne nodded grimly. Then let's bring him down. The sound of the clock ticking echoed in Dwayne's mind as he stared at the screen, the map of Reynolds' global operations flashing before him. He could almost hear the gears of the corrupt empire turning, each red blinking a reminder of just how far-reaching Reynolds' influence really was. Every location represented a piece of the puzzle, pieces Dwayne and Sarah were now tasked with bringing to light. But there was something else at play here, something even darker than the money laundering or criminal syndicates. The connections between the dots, the alliances Reynolds had carefully crafted, went deeper than anyone had realized. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore, it was a battle against an entire network of power, corruption, and violence. Dwayne turned to the man, whose face was still obscured in the shadows. "How do we shut this down?" His voice was low, filled with both urgency and determination. "You said this warehouse is where it all begins, but we need to hit them where it hurts. We need more than just information." The man stepped forward, his eyes meeting Dwayne's. "We do what Reynolds is most afraid of. We expose his entire operation. But we need to act quickly, before he moves everything underground." He gestured to the screen again, where multiple flashing red dots indicated key locations, shipping yards, private jets, secret bank accounts. "The good news is that we have everything we need to tear down his empire. The bad news? We're outnumbered, outgunned, and there's a chance Reynolds will take drastic measures to protect himself." Sarah stepped closer to Dwayne, her face grim but resolute. "We can't back down now. We've come too far. We have the evidence, the proof he's behind everything. Let's make it count." The man's lips curved into a thin smile, but it was cold and calculated. "Exactly. But we're not doing this alone. I have a few people who owe me favors, people who can help us get the word out. The key is timing. We take down Reynolds' control one piece at a time, starting with his media empire. The world needs to see the truth." Dwayne nodded, his mind racing through the next steps. "And how do we get the media involved? We know Reynolds has his fingers in everything. How do we break through that?" The man's smile deepened. "We have leverage. We use what Reynolds fears the most, his reputation. I've been working with a journalist who's been digging into his empire for months. If we can get her this information, it'll blow the lid off his entire operation. But she's in danger too. We'll need to move fast." Sarah's gaze flicked between Dwayne and the man. "We need to act before Reynolds makes his move. If he finds out we're onto him, he'll come for us." Dwayne finished her sentence. "He won't stop until we're all dead. But this ends now." The man didn't need to say anything further. He knew the stakes, and it was clear that everyone in the room understood the gravity of what was coming next. The SUV roared to life once again, this time speeding through the city streets with even more urgency. The man navigated the dark roads as though he had lived here all his life, each turn calculated and precise. Sarah sat in the back seat, her eyes glued to the screen that showed Reynolds' locations flashing red, her thoughts a whirlwind of strategy and survival. Dwayne sat beside the man, watching the city blur past them, his mind focused on one thing, taking down Reynolds. They had no time to waste. Every second counted. And as much as Dwayne wanted to believe they had a plan, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reynolds wouldn't go down without a fight. The deeper they dug into the heart of the beast, the more dangerous it would become. But they had no choice but to push forward. The truth had to come out. "We need to get to her first," the man said, breaking the silence as he took another sharp turn. "The journalist. She's the key to getting this story out there." Dwayne glanced at him. "Do we know where she is?" The man nodded, his eyes never leaving the road. "I've been in contact with her. She's meeting us at a safe location in an hour. We'll hand her everything we have, and she'll go public with it. No more hiding. Reynolds' empire crumbles the moment the world knows what he's been up to." Sarah crossed her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. And what if Reynolds is already onto us? The man's lips tightened, but he said nothing. The possibility was too real. They had to stay ahead of him, outsmart him at every turn. The longer they stayed in the open, the higher the risk. They needed to be quick and decisive. They arrived at a small, unmarked building on the outskirts of town. It was a low profile, tucked away from the main roads, blending into the shadows. The man parked the SUV, and they all stepped out, each of them scanning their surroundings with trained eyes. "This is where we'll meet her," the man said, leading them inside. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dimly lit interior with nothing but a table in the middle of the room and a few scattered chairs. They didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, a woman entered, her face partially obscured by a hood. She had the sharp, focused look of a reporter used to being in dangerous situations. Her eyes flicked over to Dwayne and Sarah before locking onto the man. "I take it you have what I need?" she asked, her voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "We do," the man replied, motioning for her to sit. "But we need to move quickly. Reynolds isn't going to let this slide. He's already on to us." The woman nodded grimly, pulling out a small notebook from her bag. "I've been tracking him for months, but this is bigger than I thought." "You're sure this is everything?" Dwayne pulled the flash drive from his pocket and handed it to her, his fingers tight around the small, fragile device. "Everything. The media empire. The money laundering. The global criminal syndicates. All of it." She took the drive, her fingers brushing his for just a moment before she plugged it into her laptop. The screen flickered to life, and Dwayne's heart pounded as the data loaded. "This is it," the woman murmured, her face lighting up with both excitement and concern. "This will be all over the news by morning." But Dwayne couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the journalist began typing rapidly, a low rumble shook the building. Dwayne's senses kicked into overdrive. Something was coming. They were no longer just chasing Reynolds, they were about to step into a war zone. The man was the first to react. He grabbed Dwayne's arm, pulling him toward the back exit. "We're not alone," he muttered under his breath. The lights flickered once more, then went out. The building plunged into darkness. The dark room was suffocating. The sound of Dwayne's breath was all he could hear as the heavy silence lingered like a storm on the horizon. The rumbling from outside had stopped, but Dwayne's instincts told him that the worst was yet to come. He could feel the tension crackling in the air as if something, or someone, was lurking, waiting to pounce. The journalist fumbled for her phone, the only source of light in the room now. "What was that?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. She was trying to keep calm, but there was an edge to her words that betrayed her fear. The man, who had been moving towards the back exit, froze. His hand gripped the doorframe, his body tense. "We've been compromised. Reynolds knows we're here." Dwayne's heart sank. They'd been one step ahead, until now. "What do we do?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the journalist, who was now frantically scrolling through her phone, trying to find anything that could help them. "You need to get out of here," the man finally said, his voice low. "You can't stay in the building. Reynolds will send his men. We need to draw them out, make sure they don't find you." The journalist's eyes widened. "I'm not leaving without the story. This is everything." Dwayne stepped closer to her, his voice urgent. "You don't understand. If Reynolds's men catch you here, we'll be dead," Sarah finished, her voice sharp. She had already moved to the corner of the room, scanning the shadows for any movement. "We need to think fast. If they're coming, we don't have long." The man nodded. "The journalist is right about one thing. We can't let this information slip through our fingers. But the priority is your safety." He turned to Dwayne. "You two, head to the back exit. I'll handle the front. I'll buy you some time." No, Dwayne said immediately, shaking his head. We stay together. Time's running out, the man insisted, his voice hard. This is bigger than any of us. You need to get that drive to the world. Get to the media. It's the only way to stop Reynolds now. Dwayne's jaw tightened. He didn't like it. He didn't like being separated, but they were in too deep now. There was no going back. They had to finish this, and fast. Stay close, Dwayne told Sarah. We'll head out the back. Stay quiet. With that, the small group moved toward the exit, their footsteps muffled in the thick silence. The only light came from the faint glow of the journalist's phone as she slipped it back into her pocket and followed them. As Dwayne opened the door slowly, he could hear muffled voices in the distance, shouts, orders being barked, the unmistakable sound of heavy boots against the ground. Reynolds had sent his men. They weren't just on their tail now, they were already here. The cold night air rushed in as the door opened, and Dwayne could see the alleyway outside. It was narrow and dark, the faint outlines of abandoned buildings casting long shadows. A perfect place to hide, if they moved fast enough. They had only made it a few steps when the sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black SUV skidded around the corner, its headlights blinding in the dark. It came to a stop with an almost cinematic precision, and the door swung open. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing. Dwayne recognized him immediately, the muscle, the enforcer, the one who had been trailing them for weeks. Damn it, Dwayne muttered under his breath. We're running out of time. Sarah whispered urgently, pulling Dwayne back into the shadows of the alley. The others followed, but their retreat was cut short by the distinct sound of more footsteps approaching from the other direction. Where are we going? Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. Dwayne's mind raced. The alley offered no escape, no exit that didn't lead them straight into enemy hands. But there was one option left, something he hoped would buy them just enough time. A fire escape ladder was visible a few feet ahead, its metal rungs promising a way up to the roof. If they could reach it. Up there, Dwayne said, nodding toward the ladder. We take the roof. They made their way quickly but quietly toward the fire escape, their movements careful, calculated. As Dwayne reached for the ladder, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps getting closer. They were almost there. They had just a few moments to make it. Dwayne, Sarah hissed. Hurry. He was the first to climb, pulling himself onto the ladder and scrambling upward. The others followed, their breath heavy with fear as the clatter of boots grew louder. Dwayne reached the roof and pulled himself over the edge, helping Sarah up after him. The journalist came last, her movements agile despite the fear that was evident in her eyes. Go, go, go. Dwayne urged, glancing back toward the alley. The SUV's headlights were now shining directly toward them. They sprinted across the rooftop, their footsteps echoing in the night. They were exposed, but the buildings provided some cover. Dwayne knew the longer they stayed up here, the more dangerous it would get, but right now, it was their only option. They reached the edge of the roof and ducked behind a ventilation unit. Dwayne peeked around the side, watching the scene below unfold. The enforcers were getting out of their SUVs now, their searchlights sweeping over the street. This is bad, Sarah muttered, her voice tight. We can't outrun them. Not like this. The journalist looked at Dwayne, her face pale under the moonlight. I can't go back to the building. They'll know I'm here. What do I do with the data? We need to get it out, fast, Dwayne said. We can't afford to wait. There's a news station a few blocks away. You know the one. The journalist nodded quickly, pulling out her phone. I know it. I'll go. I'll get this story out there. No, Dwayne said, stopping her. You're not going alone. We'll cover you. They didn't have much time. The enforcers were already looking up at the rooftops, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Dwayne's pulse raced as he turned to the others. "We need a distraction," he said, his mind whirring with possibilities. "We need to make sure they're looking the other way." Without waiting for a response, he dashed toward the far side of the roof, where a stack of old crates and debris sat. Grabbing a metal rod, he hefted it into the air. The sound of the object crashing to the ground would draw their attention. If it worked, they'd have just enough time for the journalist to escape. The metal rod clanged loudly against the rooftop, sending an echo that bounced off the surrounding buildings. Dwayne's heart hammered in his chest as the sound reverberated in the air. It was a calculated risk, but they didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The enforcers below would have heard it, and if luck was on their side, it would be enough to divert their attention long enough for the others to slip away unnoticed. "Move!" Dwayne barked, his voice hoarse as he waved the others forward. Sarah and the journalist didn't hesitate. They darted toward the far corner of the roof, keeping low and out of sight. The distraction was working. Dwayne could hear the shuffling of boots as the men below turned toward the source of the noise. Their movements were hurried, eager. They hadn't yet spotted the team, but they would soon. Dwayne glanced back one last time. The enforcers were already climbing the fire escape, rushing to the roof. He didn't have time to wait. He turned and followed the others, his legs pumping as they ran along the narrow rooftop. The sky above them was dark, the only light coming from the flickering streetlights below. It wasn't much, but it was enough to guide them as they navigated the maze of rooftops. They reached another fire escape, this one leading down to an alley several stories below. Dwayne motioned for them to go first, then followed close behind. The cold metal of the ladder bit into his hands as he descended quickly. The sounds of pursuit were still faint, but it wouldn't take long for Reynolds' men to figure out they were on the move again. Once they hit the ground, Dwayne took a moment to assess the surroundings. They were in the middle of a residential neighborhood, the streets empty and eerily quiet. The perfect cover. "We can't stay here long," he said, glancing around. "We need to get to the news station, now. We can't waste any more time." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. "How far is it?" "A few blocks," Dwayne said, already moving. "We'll have to stick to the back streets. If we stay on the main roads, they'll catch up to us." The journalist, who had been oddly silent up to this point, spoke up. "I can get there faster on my own. I know a shortcut." Dwayne hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to split up again, but they were running out of options. They couldn't afford to be seen, and every second counted. "Are you sure you'll be safe?" The journalist gave him a determined look. "I'm a reporter. I've gotten out of worse situations than this." Dwayne reluctantly nodded. "All right. You head to the station. We'll follow, but keep your phone on. If anything goes wrong, call us immediately." She gave a quick nod and vanished into the shadows, moving faster than Dwayne expected. He watched her go, then turned to Sarah. "Let's go." They kept to the shadows, sticking to the alleys as they made their way toward the news station. Dwayne's mind raced as he moved. He kept thinking about Reynolds. The man was ruthless, and even though they had exposed part of his empire, Dwayne knew Reynolds wouldn't go down without a fight. The journalist's report, if it made it to the airwaves, could be the final blow that took down Reynolds for good, but if they didn't make it in time, if Reynolds found them first, all their work would have been for nothing. Every step seemed to echo in Dwayne's ears as they moved through the dark streets. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But there was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher. They reached the outskirts of the news station's block, and Dwayne held up his hand, signaling for Sarah to stop. He could see the building ahead, a tall structure that loomed above the smaller buildings surrounding it. It was a beacon of light in the otherwise darkened streets, but Dwayne wasn't fooled. If Reynolds had eyes in the city, he would have known that they were headed here. They needed to be cautious. "Stay close," he whispered, taking the lead as they approached the front entrance. The large glass doors were locked, but there was a side entrance, one that led directly to the back offices. Dwayne moved silently, his eyes darting around the street for any sign of movement. It was almost too quiet. As they reached the side door, Dwayne pushed it open gently. The hinges creaked, but the sound was swallowed by the night. They slipped inside, taking a deep breath as they entered the building. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the emergency exit signs above them. "This way," Dwayne muttered, leading them through the narrow hallway that would take them to the newsroom. They moved quickly, quietly. The silence between them was thick with tension. Every footstep felt like it could betray them, every creak of the floorboards too loud. They passed empty offices, darkened desks, and closed doors, each of them holding their breath in fear of what might be waiting around the corner. They reached the newsroom door, and Dwayne paused, pressing his ear against the wood. He could hear voices inside, muffled, but definitely there. A flicker of hope ignited inside him. The journalist must have made it in time. He pushed open the door just a crack, peering inside. The room was full of reporters and technicians, huddled around the central news desk. The woman from earlier was standing at the front, her back to them, her phone in hand. She was on the phone, speaking quickly but clearly. Dwayne's pulse quickened. They had made it. The story was about to break. "Sarah," he whispered, "get ready. We need to get in there now." But as they prepared to enter, a sudden noise from behind them stopped them in their tracks. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy boots. Dwayne's stomach dropped. They weren't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and Dwayne's pulse raced. He turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway behind them. It was impossible to know how many men were coming, but the sound was unmistakable. Reynolds' enforcers were closing in on them, and they weren't here for pleasantries. "Go," Dwayne whispered urgently to Sarah. "We need to get to that newsroom now." Sarah didn't hesitate. Her hand brushed against the cold metal of the door as she pushed it open, slipping into the newsroom. Dwayne followed close behind, his senses on high alert. They had seconds at best before the enforcers arrived, and once the door closed, they would be trapped in a confined space with nowhere to run. The newsroom was chaotic. Several reporters sat hunched over their desks, their fingers flying over keyboards, oblivious to the danger that was quickly closing in. The woman from earlier was still on the phone, her back to the door, speaking quickly into the receiver as her eyes flicked across the screen in front of her. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. They had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. He had to ensure the journalist got the story out and that they all walked out alive. The door to the newsroom slammed open, and several of Reynolds' men rushed in, guns drawn. "Get down," one of them shouted. Chaos erupted in an instant. Dwayne instinctively dropped to the ground, pulling Sarah and the journalist down with him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. But there was no easy escape. The enforcers had the newsroom surrounded, and it would only be a matter of time before they reached the group. "Where is the data?" one of the enforcers demanded, his voice like ice. The woman at the front of the room, still standing by the desk, froze. She didn't answer immediately, but her hand moved toward the drawer. Dwayne's mind raced. They had to act before the enforcers made their move. "Now," the enforcer barked. Without thinking, Dwayne sprang to his feet. He grabbed the nearest chair and hurled it at the enforcer with the gun, sending him stumbling backward. The rest of the enforcers whirled toward him, their guns trained on his position. But Dwayne didn't stop. He lunged toward the woman who was holding the phone, knocking it from her hand and shoving her aside. She let out a startled cry, but Dwayne didn't give her a second glance. His focus was entirely on the task at hand. "Give it to me now," Dwayne shouted at the woman. She nodded quickly, pointing to a nearby computer. "It's all on that drive," she said, her voice trembling. "It's ready to go live." Dwayne's eyes flashed toward the desk. The data was ready. They were moments away from exposing Reynolds for good. But he couldn't afford to celebrate just yet. "Sarah, get the drive," Dwayne ordered, never taking his eyes off the enforcers. Sarah sprinted toward the desk, her movements sharp and focused. The journalist, still crouched on the floor, scrambled to her feet and followed closely behind. The tension in the room was palpable. The enforcers stood motionless, waiting for Dwayne to make the next move. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity. But just as Sarah reached the desk, one of the enforcers lunged forward, a gunshot ringing out through the room. It wasn't aimed at her, Dwayne had positioned himself between her and the gunman. The bullet grazed his arm, and a searing pain shot through his body. "Dwayne!" Sarah cried, but Dwayne didn't have time to focus on the pain. "Get the drive," he yelled, his voice gritted through clenched teeth. The journalist had reached the desk by now and was inserting the drive into the computer. The screen flickered to life as the file transferred, but the enforcers were closing in. There was no more time. With a loud crash, Dwayne grabbed one of the chairs, swung it at the closest enforcer, and sent him sprawling. The gunshot that followed was deafening, but it wasn't directed at him. Instead, it hit the other enforcer square in the shoulder. Dwayne's eyes locked onto Sarah, who was now standing next to the desk, a look of determination on her face. "It's done," she said breathlessly, holding up the drive in her hand. "It's going live now." Relief washed over Dwayne, but it was short-lived. He knew Reynolds wasn't going to stop here. The fight was far from over, but this was their chance to strike a fatal blow. "Get to the back," Dwayne shouted to the journalist and Sarah. "I'll hold them off." "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We stick together." Another round of gunfire erupted. Dwayne instinctively shielded Sarah, pushing her down to the floor as bullets ricocheted off the walls. The journalists and other staff members scattered, diving under desks and behind filing cabinets, but the enforcers were relentless. "Move," Dwayne urged, his voice low. He grabbed Sarah's arm and yanked her toward the back door. The journalist followed, clutching the drive in her hand. As they rushed toward the exit, the door burst open, and another wave of enforcers flooded into the room. "Run!" Dwayne shouted, his body screaming with pain as he forced his legs to move. But just as they reached the back door, it slammed shut, trapping them inside. "Damn it," Dwayne muttered. The only way out now was through the window. Without a second thought, Dwayne threw his body against the window, shattering the glass. The sharp sound of breaking glass filled the room as he climbed through the jagged remains, his arm bleeding but his resolve unshaken. "Follow me," he barked, helping Sarah and the journalist through the window. The night air was cold against their skin as they landed in the alleyway behind the building. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Dwayne allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. The drive was out. The story was live. Now it was just a matter of survival. The cool night air cut through Dwayne's shirt, but it was the rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins that made him feel alive. They had made it out of the newsroom, but the clock was ticking. Reynolds' men were hot on their trail, and their window of opportunity was shrinking fast. Dwayne turned to Sarah and the journalist as they crouched in the shadow of the alley. The streetlights up ahead were dim, but they still cast enough of a glow to keep the surroundings in sight. "We need to move fast," Dwayne said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll be coming after us. We can't let them catch us again." The journalist, still clutching the drive, nodded without hesitation. "I'm not stopping until we get this story out." "Good," Dwayne said, giving her a sharp look. "That's what I need to hear." Sarah pulled out her phone, her face tense as she checked for any news. She found something that made her eyes widen. "They're already talking about us on the news," Sarah said, her voice strained. "Reynolds is trying to spin this as a hoax. He's saying that what we've got is fake." "That won't stop us," Dwayne replied, trying to steady the frustration bubbling inside him. "We've got the truth on that drive, and we'll make sure it gets to the right people." A sudden sound, footsteps, snapped him out of his thoughts. They were approaching, getting closer. Dwayne's hand instinctively reached for his side, where the gun he had picked up earlier was holstered. He glanced over at Sarah, signaling for them to stay quiet and move quickly. Without waiting for a response, Dwayne slipped into the darkness, motioning for Sarah and the journalist to follow him. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for them to move shoulder to shoulder. They had to keep low, stay quiet. Every step was measured, calculated. Dwayne's mind was racing. They needed to find an escape route. He could feel the weight of the drive in the journalist's hand, and with it came the responsibility to make sure this information didn't get buried by Reynolds' machine. He led them through a series of alleyways, moving as fast as he could while still remaining out of sight. Every turn brought them closer to safety, but also closer to danger. As they reached another corner, Dwayne stopped short. He could see them. Reynolds' men, 3 of them, walking with purpose. Dwayne pressed his back against the wall, motioning for the others to do the same. The tension was palpable. He could hear their heavy footsteps drawing nearer, the sound of their radios crackling with static. He held his breath, waiting for the right moment. If they could get past these men, they would have a chance. But one mistake, one wrong move, and they'd be caught. The group of enforcers rounded the corner, but Dwayne had already calculated their path. He waited, counting down the seconds in his head. Now. Dwayne surged forward, grabbing one of the enforcers by the arm and twisting him into the wall with a quick, brutal move. The man grunted, but Dwayne didn't give him a chance to react. He knocked him out with one punch, silencing the man before he could make a sound. The other 2 enforcers whipped around, but they were too slow. Dwayne threw himself at the second enforcer, slamming him into the side of the alley, knocking the wind out of him. In a matter of seconds, the man was on the ground, incapacitated. Dwayne didn't waste a second. He grabbed the third enforcer, holding him at gunpoint. The man's eyes widened, and Dwayne could see the recognition in his eyes. He knew who Dwayne was, and that only made this more dangerous. "Where's Reynolds?" Dwayne growled, keeping the gun steady. The enforcer sneered but didn't answer. "I'll ask again," Dwayne said, pressing the barrel harder against the man's chest. "Where is Reynolds?" The enforcer's face twisted with frustration, but he finally gave in. "He's got men stationed at the old warehouse, down by the docks. He's waiting for you." Dwayne didn't need to hear more. He nodded sharply and knocked the enforcer out with the butt of his gun, dropping him to the ground without another word. "Let's go," he said, turning back to Sarah and the journalist, who had been waiting in the shadows. "That was close," Sarah said, her voice low. "Do you think they'll be there?" "They'll be there," Dwayne said, his jaw clenched. "Reynolds won't stop until he gets what he wants. But now we know where to go." The old warehouse by the docks was a place of little consequence to most people. It had been abandoned for years. But to Reynolds, it was more than just a hideout. It was where he would make his final stand. Dwayne's hands were shaking, but it wasn't from fear. It was the realization that they were finally cornering Reynolds. Everything was about to come to a head. He glanced at the journalist, who still had the drive in her hand, clutching it as if her life depended on it. And in many ways, it did. They continued to move through the alleyways, every corner a potential danger. Dwayne's mind was racing, calculating every possible outcome. If they reached the warehouse, there would be no turning back. Reynolds would either surrender or die trying. But Dwayne wasn't ready to think about that yet. They had one goal, and that was to ensure the truth got out. As they neared the warehouse district, Dwayne's instincts flared. He knew they were getting close. But they weren't the only ones on the move. From the far side of the street, headlights appeared, casting long shadows across the pavement. The vehicles came to a screeching halt, and several enforcers spilled out onto the road, all of them heading toward the entrance of the warehouse. "Shit," Dwayne muttered. "We've been spotted." The time for subtlety was over. There was no more sneaking around. They would have to fight their way through. "We can't wait any longer," Dwayne said, his voice harsh with determination. "Let's finish this." The silence that followed the frantic exchange felt surreal. The warehouse, once a place of bustle and industry, now held only the echo of their footsteps and the deep breaths of those still standing. Dwayne stood tall, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through his veins. Reynolds was sprawled on the floor, gasping for air, the wind knocked out of him from the blows Dwayne had landed. The fight wasn't over yet, but they were close. So close. Dwayne's eyes locked on Reynolds, who was slowly crawling away, his hands clutching his stomach, desperate to regain his strength. But it was no use. The enforcers were down. The journalist had the drive. And Reynolds was alone. "You think you've won?" Reynolds wheezed, looking up at Dwayne with fury burning in his eyes. "You've done nothing. You've only delayed the inevitable." Dwayne took a step forward, his gun still drawn, steady in his hand. The weight of it felt oddly comforting, even as the tension in his chest mounted. "You don't get to decide what happens next, Reynolds," Dwayne said, his voice cold. "It's over. You're done." Reynolds let out a bitter laugh, but there was no conviction in it. He knew it. Dwayne knew it. They were at the end of the line. "You can't stop what's coming," Reynolds muttered, his voice cracking. "The system is bigger than you, Dwayne. It always has been." Dwayne didn't respond. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the culmination of everything that had led them here. All the lies, all the manipulation, all the bloodshed, it was finally over. The truth was out there, and Reynolds was powerless to stop it now. Dwayne's attention shifted as he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, instinctively ready to react, but when he saw who it was, he relaxed. Sarah and the journalist emerged from the shadows, their faces tense but resolute. The journalist's hand was still wrapped tightly around the drive. "We've got it," the journalist said, her voice almost a whisper, as though she couldn't quite believe it herself. "The truth. It's all here." Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't over yet. But they were closer to finishing it. Much closer. He looked at Sarah, then back at the journalist. "Get it to the authorities. Now," Dwayne ordered. "No more delays. No more distractions. This is it." The journalist nodded, her hands shaking as she clutched the drive to her chest. "I won't let you down. I promise." She turned, moving quickly toward the exit, but Dwayne's gaze stayed fixed on Reynolds. Reynolds was struggling to rise to his feet, his face contorted in pain, but Dwayne wasn't about to let him go so easily. He stepped forward, placing a firm boot on Reynolds' chest, pinning him to the floor. "You're not going anywhere," Dwayne said quietly. "Not until the cops get here." Reynolds snarled, but Dwayne wasn't listening. He could hear the sirens in the distance, growing louder as the sound of approaching police cars reached his ears. It wouldn't be long now before this nightmare was over. The journalist was already disappearing into the night, on her way to deliver the drive that would bring Reynolds down for good. Dwayne couldn't help but feel a pang of pride for her. She had done what so many others had failed to do, she had stayed strong in the face of fear, had pushed through the chaos, and had made sure the truth would see the light of day. And just as the sirens grew closer, Dwayne felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He knew there would be consequences. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, Dwayne felt like he was finally on the right side of things. The truth was out. Reynolds had lost. And Dwayne had won. As the police cars screeched to a halt outside, their lights flashing, Dwayne stood, watching them with a mix of relief and exhaustion. His job was done. He had stopped the man who had terrorized the city. He had saved countless lives. But the real victory, the one that mattered most, was in the hands of the journalist. The truth, the story they had fought for so long to expose, was about to be heard by the world. Reynolds was done. The truth was out. And the world would never be the same. The dawn was breaking, casting a faint golden glow over the wreckage of the night. The world outside the warehouse was slowly waking up, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. The sirens had faded, replaced by the distant sounds of birds chirping, the rhythmic hum of a city coming to life. But for Dwayne, Sarah, and the journalist, the battle was far from over. As Dwayne watched the last of the police cars leave the docks, he felt a strange sense of emptiness settle in his chest. It was over, and yet, the weight of everything still lingered. The fight had been won, but the consequences were far from clear. How would the world react to the truth that had just been unleashed? Would it be enough to bring real change, or would it be buried under the weight of bureaucracy and corruption? Dwayne wasn't sure. But what he was sure of was that he couldn't go back to the life he had before. The mission was complete, the bad guys were caught, but something inside him had shifted. He couldn't simply return to being a shadow in the city, an unimportant cog in a machine that ran on lies. He had seen too much. He had fought too hard. "You all right?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking the stillness that had settled around them. She had been quiet since the journalist had disappeared into the night, her face still tense, the adrenaline of the previous hours clearly wearing off. Dwayne turned toward her, his eyes narrowing as the first rays of sunlight touched the skyline. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding back. Now, in the quiet aftermath, the weight of it all hit him in full force. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, his voice raw. "I really don't know." Sarah studied him for a long moment, her gaze soft but knowing. "You did what you had to do. You stopped Reynolds, and you brought the truth to light. That's what matters. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just, let it settle." He took a deep breath, trying to push aside the unease that gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the victory, the fight, or even Reynolds going down. It was about the uncertainty of what came next. What was the point of it all? The city would change, sure, but would it be enough to fix the years of corruption? Or was it all just another battle in an endless war? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. It was the journalist. Her face was drawn but determined, and as she stepped into the dim light of the warehouse, she held something in her hand, the drive. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. She had come back. "Did you get it to them?" he asked, his voice thick with anticipation. The journalist nodded, a weary smile tugging at her lips. "I did. It's in the right hands now. They'll know what to do with it. The authorities are already putting things into motion. Reynolds won't be getting away with this." Dwayne let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That was the moment they had all been fighting for, the moment where it was no longer just about survival, about trying to make it out alive. It was about ensuring that everything they had worked for wasn't for nothing. "That's good," Dwayne said quietly, his eyes locking with hers. "You did good. We all did." Sarah stepped forward, a slight grin on her face. "So, what now? The fight's over, right?" Dwayne's gaze lingered on the horizon. The city was waking up, unaware of the massive shift that had just occurred beneath its feet. It was a moment of quiet before the storm, before the true impact of what had happened started to unfold. But Dwayne knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this place, in this moment, forever. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, looking over at her. "I think we keep moving forward. The world doesn't stop just because we've won a battle. There's always another fight to be had. The journalist tilted her head. But what happens next? What do we do now that the truth is out? Dwayne smiled faintly, though it was tinged with a sense of uncertainty. We keep fighting. We keep pushing. The truth is out there now, but it won't be easy. It never is. There's always going to be someone who wants to bury it, someone who wants to turn a blind eye. And you? Sarah asked. Are you going to keep fighting? Dwayne didn't answer immediately. He had to think about it, weigh the options. He had spent so long chasing something, justice, truth, a way out of the mess his life had become, that he hadn't stopped to think about what came after. He had been consumed by the mission, by the war, but now, the battle was won. What was left? He looked at Sarah, then at the journalist. I don't know, he admitted. But maybe it's time I figure that out. The three of them stood in silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavy. The city was waking up, the world was changing, and the consequences of everything that had happened were still unfolding. But for the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt something that had been missing for a while, hope. It wasn't going to be easy, not by a long shot. There would be battles ahead. The aftermath of everything they had just done was uncertain. But Dwayne had always been good at facing uncertainty. And so, with one final glance toward the horizon, Dwayne made his choice. He would keep moving forward. No matter the cost. Let's go, he said, his voice steady now. There's more work to be done. And with that, they walked into the new day, leaving the warehouse behind, but carrying with them the knowledge that they had changed something. The fight was far from over. But they were ready for whatever came next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pavement as Dwayne, Sarah, and the journalist made their way down the street, the weight of their journey still heavy on their shoulders. The world outside felt different now, quieter somehow, as though the city was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. The events of the past few days had set a new course, one that none of them could predict. Yet, as the three of them walked side by side, there was an unspoken understanding between them. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Dwayne's mind raced with thoughts, none of them particularly pleasant. The truth was out, yes, but how would it be received? Would the world really change, or would it simply slip into the background, forgotten like so many other scandals? Corruption ran deep, and Dwayne knew that one battle wouldn't change everything. But it was a start. That had to be enough. We did it, Sarah said softly, breaking the silence as they approached the car parked at the curb. She looked exhausted, her face drawn, but there was a flicker of pride in her eyes. We actually did it. Dwayne nodded, but his gaze remained distant. We did. But I'm not sure what's going to happen now. The journalist, walking a few paces ahead of them, turned around and looked back at Dwayne, her face lined with determination. We'll see it through. We've already taken the first step. Now, it's about making sure the truth doesn't get buried. Dwayne glanced at her, a mixture of admiration and caution in his eyes. She had been a force of nature through this whole ordeal, brave, relentless, and unflinching in the face of danger. But now that the truth was out, the real challenge was just beginning. The authorities had the drive, but the system would fight back. It always did. He opened the door of the car and slid into the driver's seat. The others followed suit, and for a moment, there was only the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the tires on the road. They didn't speak much as they drove through the city, the streets feeling oddly unfamiliar now. Perhaps it was because they had seen too much, or perhaps it was because everything felt uncertain. They had played their part in a much bigger story, but that didn't mean it was over. I don't want to sound cynical, the journalist said, her voice breaking the silence, but this doesn't feel like the end. Not yet. Dwayne met her gaze in the rearview mirror. I know. It's far from over. Sarah turned toward the journalist, her expression guarded. What do you mean? I thought once the authorities had the evidence, it'd be done. This was the hard part. The journalist sighed. The hard part is getting the people in power to act on it. The system is a beast, and the truth isn't always enough to topple it. You think they're just going to let Reynolds and his people go down without a fight? They'll have their allies, their defenses. This isn't over until the arrests are made, until the full weight of this hits the public. Dwayne glanced at Sarah and saw the concern in her eyes. He understood it. The idea of it all, of the powerful people behind Reynolds, the ones who had been pulling the strings, was enough to make anyone question if their efforts would ever truly matter. But that didn't mean they could stop now. We'll just have to make sure it doesn't get swept under the rug, Dwayne said quietly, determination creeping into his voice. We'll keep pushing. We'll make sure the truth is heard, no matter what. The car fell into another silence, the weight of what lay ahead heavy in the air. Dwayne could feel the tension building between them, each of them processing the same uncertain future in their own way. But through it all, he knew one thing: they had made a difference. And they couldn't turn back now. As they made their way toward the safe house, Dwayne thought about the road ahead. They had taken down one man, but there were always others, more insidious and more entrenched in the system. There was no easy solution. But at least they had the truth on their side, and that, Dwayne thought, was something worth fighting for. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached the safe house, and the world outside felt just a little bit brighter. The drive was over, but the real work was only beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way. But Dwayne had learned something in the heat of battle. He had learned that even in the darkest of times, hope could still shine through. As they stepped out of the car, Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. What now, Dwayne? Do we just wait? Do we hope they do the right thing? Dwayne shook his head. No. We don't wait. We make sure the right thing is done. We take this fight to the people, to the media, to anyone who will listen. The system won't change itself. But together, we can make sure that the truth doesn't die. He turned toward the door, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the battle was only beginning. The journey had been long, and the road ahead would be even longer. But Dwayne had never been one to shy away from a fight. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready for whatever the future had in store. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with anticipation and the faint sound of the city outside seeping through the walls. Dwayne sat at a small wooden table, his hands resting on its surface, deep in thought. The world felt like it was moving at a pace he couldn't keep up with, faster, more chaotic, and less predictable than ever before. He had fought his way through an impossible mess, and yet here he was, still unsure of what came next. Sarah paced back and forth across the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The journalist sat across from Dwayne, her fingers tapping nervously against her laptop, her eyes darting from the screen to Dwayne as if searching for answers she wasn't sure she could find. Anything? Sarah asked, breaking the silence. The journalist looked up, a grim expression on her face. I've sent the story out to every major outlet I can think of. But so far, nothing. Silence. A couple of anonymous messages, but nothing that tells me people are really listening. Dwayne leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. The weight of everything was pressing down on him, harder than ever before. They had exposed the truth. They had done what they set out to do, but now the real challenge began. The story was out there, but was it enough? Would anyone care? We knew this wouldn't be easy, Dwayne said, his voice hoarse. But why does it feel like we're fighting an invisible war? Because we are, the journalist replied, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. The people we're up against have the power to control the narrative. They can bury the truth if they want to. And right now, it feels like that's exactly what they're trying to do. Sarah stopped pacing and stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. But what if we keep pushing? What if we make this public, make enough noise that they can't ignore us? Dwayne turned to Sarah, his eyes sharp. And what if that just makes things worse? What if they come after us, after you? We've seen what they're capable of. I'm not trying to scare you, but we can't act recklessly. This isn't just about us anymore. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah's expression softened. She knew he was right. But there was something burning inside her, a fierce desire to see this fight through to the end. They couldn't stop now. Not when they had already come so far. Maybe we don't have to fight them directly, the journalist said suddenly, breaking the tension. Maybe we start small. Get the people on our side. If we can rally the public, make this an issue they can't ignore, maybe we can force the system to act. Dwayne considered her words for a moment. The journalist was right. They had seen the power of the media, the way a story could capture the public's imagination and spark change. But they also knew that it wasn't that simple. There would be resistance. There would be people who didn't want the truth to see the light of day. And they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. You're talking about a revolution, Dwayne said, his voice low. A public outcry that forces their hand. It's the only way, the journalist replied. We can't rely on the system to fix itself. The system is broken. It's up to us, up to the people, to make sure this story doesn't fade into obscurity. Dwayne's eyes flicked toward the window, his gaze distant. The idea of it felt both thrilling and terrifying. A revolution, a fight for truth against a system built on lies and corruption. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be setbacks, sacrifices, and more struggles ahead. But deep down, he knew it was the only path forward. I don't know if we're ready for that, Dwayne muttered. The system is too big. Too powerful. What if we're just throwing ourselves into the fire? Sarah turned to face him, her eyes burning with resolve. We have to try. If we don't, what's the point of everything we've done? If we don't stand up now, we're just letting them win. Dwayne looked at her, then at the journalist. Both of them had been by his side through everything, through the danger, the deception, the blood and sweat. They had risked it all to bring the truth to light. And now, they were asking him to take another leap of faith. The stakes were higher than ever before. All right, he said finally, his voice steady. Let's do it. But we do it smart. We get the people on our side first. We need allies. We need momentum. And we need to be ready for whatever comes next. The journalist nodded, a fire lighting in her eyes. I've already started reaching out to a few contacts. We'll get the word out. It's time to make noise. We need to be careful, Dwayne reminded them, his tone serious. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. We'll be careful, Sarah said, a determined smile tugging at her lips. But we can't be afraid anymore. We've already come this far. It's time to finish what we started. With that, the team gathered their things, ready to take the next step. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were ready. They had come too far to turn back now. As they walked out of the room, Dwayne couldn't help but feel a sense of determination settle over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but they had something that no one could take away, the truth. And as long as they had that, they had hope. The world was about to change. Whether they liked it or not, Dwayne knew they would be at the center of it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?